steel, firearms, and the industrialists crossing into another world. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 701 Close Combat. Alder expects everyone to fulfill their duties. Paul's message sparked a small discussion among the generals of Crystal Radiance. I admit, the Earl's words are encouraging, but isn't it a bit presumptuous for him to say them? Some felt a pang of jealousy. They were nobles from the royal capital, Crystal Radiance, the rightful representatives of the kingdom. Paul Gleman, on the other hand, was merely a lord in the northwest corner. Many glanced furtively at the person they considered most qualified to speak, Princess Catherine. The princess's face was flushed, revealing unusual excitement. Her red lips moved as if she were repeatedly chewing on her words. Often it cleared her throat heavily, reminding everyone, Earl Gleman is the royal son-in-law, so he's not wrong to say that. The crowd felt slightly more at ease. Just then, the Orc cavalry drew closer, increasing their speed, thick dust billowing into the sky, a sight that chilled the heart. Many who had experienced a battle of Sunset Valley began to tremble. It was at this moment that the god of war roared. Under the unified command of Artillery Commander Bryce, all the cannons opened fire almost simultaneously. Dozens of projectiles rained down on the Orc cavalry, unleashing human fury upon the enemy. These cannons were not directly facing the enemy, each was angled, creating a terrifying crossfire. The Orc cavalry, beginning their charge, were immediately struck dumb. Shells whistled through the air and across the ground, and neither the magnificent war horses nor their riders could withstand these deadly metal contraptions. Limbs and blood flew everywhere. The horses in the bombardment zone were terrified, and no matter how hard their riders tried, they couldn't control their frenzied galloping. Chaos erupted in several parts of the Orc army. Some runaway horses collided with riders, and some riders were thrown from their horses and trampled into a bloody pulp by their uncontrollable companions. The massive artillery barrage had an effect that surprised both sides. However, for a charge of tens of thousands of cavalry, it was still a minor ripple. The Orc cavalry continued their charge, unstoppable, the earth itself trembling. Catherine anxiously looked towards Paul's location. The enemy's objective was clear, to tear apart the infantry in the center. Could those Northwesterners withstand it? The Arda army in the center began to change formation. 8 battalions, 4,000 men, quickly transformed into 2 hollow squares. Having exchanged tactics beforehand, this formation wasn't surprising to the Allied commanders, but the speed of the change was astonishing. Meanwhile, the Allied infantry from other territories had already formed squares before the Orcs' attack, their spears forming a forest, facing outwards on all sides, with archers surrounded in the center. Schroeder's only order to them was to hold their ground, not to move an inch. The Arda artillery fired a second volley, the thick smoke almost completely obscuring their front. The swirling mist and the devastation of the cannonballs greatly intimidated many Orc cavalrymen, as if some predatory monster lurked behind the thick smoke. But they were only a few hundred meters from the human infantry ranks. In a little while, their superior horsemanship would allow them to toy with these frail creatures, no matter how powerful their weapons. The third volley began, and unlike before, the Orc cavalrymen at the forefront seemed to have crashed into an invisible, transparent wall of air, making it appear as if the entire army had come to a standstill. The Arda artillery fired shrapnel, countless metal pellets scattering and sending Orc cavalrymen sprawling, their effect even greater than the previous solid shot. This bombardment caused immense chaos among the enemy, even briefly halting the offensive to some extent. Seeing the fate of their comrades ahead, the cavalrymen behind them restrained their mounts, slowing them down. Their actions undoubtedly hindered those further back, even causing many horses to huddle together. Sound the horns, the Orc commander, Kellum, roared in fury, urging his men to continue the attack. Quick! Fire another round. Bryce was overjoyed. He had estimated that the Orc cavalry's attack speed would allow the artillery only 3 rounds, but the enemy's reaction had given them another round of time. With the roar of the cannons, another volley of shrapnel was hurled at the enemy as they regrouped, knocking down many cavalrymen and their horses. But urged on by the horns, the Orcs launched another attack. The Arda artillery retreated into the hollow square of the infantry as planned, leaving the heavy cannons in place. The Orc cavalry were within 100 meters. Fire! At the chorus of commands, the two squares facing the enemy began to fire. The first rank immediately crouched down after firing, using their rifle butts for support, with their sharp bayonets pointing outwards. The first Orc cavalrymen who charged to the front, or their mounts, were hit and screamed in agony, but they provided cover for their comrades behind them. The two sides clashed in close combat. Paul, covered in cold sweat, forced himself to remain calm as he watched his soldiers face the test of life and death. Thankfully, the imagined scene of cavalry charging fearlessly at high speed, reminiscent of movies, didn't materialize. He remembered the awe-inspiring cavalry charges in The Lord of the Rings, where Rohirrim cavalry charged at breakneck speed, crashing headlong into the Orcish spear-laden jungle, slicing through the defenses like a hot knife through butter, sending the enemy sprawling. Even after breaking through, their momentum didn't wane, continuing to charge through the dense enemy ranks for a considerable distance. If the Orc cavalry in this world were as fierce as the Rohirrim cavalry, their thin, hollow square formation would surely be pierced instantly, turning into pools of mincemeat under swords and hooves. Of course, the Orcs would also suffer heavy casualties. But the scene before him was more like the French fighting style in Waterloo, not a direct charge into the square, but rather a maneuvering that turned their horses sharply, moving along the edge of the formation. Some slowed down, exchanging blows with the Arda soldiers wielding bayonets before disengaging, others merely feinted, still others drew their bows and fired arrows. In cavalry versus infantry combat, the most crucial element is the psychological battle. Faced with an overwhelming cavalry charge, infantry often crumbles before the enemy can even get close, exposing their backs to the far faster cavalry for slaughter. The Orcs discovered a large gap between their phalanxes, and large numbers of cavalry immediately slipped into it, flowing like water along a ditch. They attempted to employ their signature cavalry tactic, attacking from the flanks or rear. Instantly, the phalanxes were surrounded, seemingly isolated and helpless. Chapter 702 Stabilize. The outermost soldiers of the phalanx desperately blocked the Orcs' swords with their bayonets, providing cover for the soldiers inside. The inner soldiers took turns firing loaded muskets, aiming, and pulling the triggers. Bang! Blood blossomed where their weapons were aimed. The innermost soldiers were responsible for reloading ammunition to ensure their comrades' continuous firepower. Their rigorous daily training paid off. At such close range, almost everyone hit their mark. Besides the mounted cavalry, the larger war horses were also excellent targets. Orc cavalrymen weaved through the gaps between the phalanxes, but they quickly discovered that no matter which direction they went, human soldiers were firing at them with those terrifying flamethrowers. Orcs caught between two phalanxes found themselves caught in a pincer attack from both sides. They used their horsemanship to its fullest extent, attacking, taunting, and shooting arrows, trying to tear open a corner of the phalanx, but all the human soldiers remained unmoved and unyielding. When a soldier was killed or wounded, someone immediately took his place. The tactic of striking and disengaging failed. No one would break formation to fight, nor was it necessary. The Orcs discovered that the flamethrowers of the human soldiers had a much longer range than their shortbows, and their war horses were no match for the deadly projectiles. Armor offered effective protection against arrows, but was useless against projectiles whose trajectories were almost invisible to the naked eye. Explosions rang out as a barrage of musket fire erupted, thick smoke billowing across the battlefield. Orc cavalrymen, shrouded in smoke, could not see their comrades in the distance, only the relentless barrage of deadly projectiles filled the air. This unfamiliar combat environment made one wonder if the humans had used some kind of sorcery. The infantry's fear of cavalry stemmed not only from the overwhelming momentum of their charge, but also from a lack of means to counter them. If you had a metal storm or a tank nearby, even a large number of cavalrymen would be nothing more than a pile of meat. Although the Arda soldiers only carried flintlock muskets, through continuous iteration and improvement, they had long transcended the realm of primitive firearms, their range and power far surpassing the short bows used by the Orcs on horseback. The Orc cavalry's usual hit-and-run tactics were ineffective. Horses couldn't outrun bullets, and pulling the trigger was easier than turning the horse around. The solution was to overcome the fear of what they feared, discover that the enemy could also be killed. The Arda soldiers recovered from their initial panic and began to calmly and methodically respond to the enemy's attack. They drew most of the Orc cavalry's charge. The friendly soldiers on the flanks, seeing through the smoke that the Arda were being swamped by the Orc cavalry, were initially terrified. If the Arda in the center were defeated, the entire Arda army would undoubtedly be cut into two unsupportable parts. The officers hesitated whether to move their soldiers to the center to support the Arda. Some brave men had even begun to move. Schroeder noticed their movements in time and immediately dispatched a fast horseman, strictly ordering them not to move rashly. They soon had no time to attend to the Arda soldiers, as the Orc cavalry also began their attack on them. As planned, the Allied forces, like the Arda army, formed a hollow square, with archers protected in the center and dense spears pointing in four directions. In fact, their spears were more effective than the bayonets of the Arda soldiers in repelling cavalry charges. The fierce battle raged for a long time, and the Allied forces were pleasantly surprised to find that the Arda army in the center had held firm, attracting the main force of the Orc cavalry like a magnet. Although the poor environment made visibility poor, the sound of musket fire was easily audible, the popping of muskets never ceasing for a quarter of an hour. Correspondingly, wounded Orc cavalrymen were constantly retreating hastily from the smoke. This greatly encouraged them. This battle was promising. Those Orc cavalrymen who bravely inserted themselves into the gaps between the squares were the most unfortunate. The crossfire from both sides caused heavy casualties, with many falling from their horses. Due to the smoke, many lost their bearings, and some scattered Orc cavalrymen even rushed near Paul and his men, only to be killed or captured by the guards due to their inferior numbers. "Bring him over here," Paul called to the guards. A recently captured prisoner was brought before him by the soldiers. Paul watched him with interest. This was the first time he had seen orcs in this world, the second race other than humans. He had previously seen a dwarf, a guy obsessed with reclaiming his chieftainship. He wondered how his princely revenge was going. The orc before him was a tall, robust man, with a broad back like a panel, thick hair visible through the gaps in his armor. The prisoner tried to struggle, but quickly received a beating. Although the orc was strong, the Arda soldiers serving as Paul's guards were also hand-picked burly men, and besides, his hands were bound. His legs were kicked hard, forcing him to his knees. Two guards pressed down on his back, preventing him from standing up. "Humans, the orc, with two bruised eyes, still refused to give in. You used evil black magic, despicable," Paul scoffed. "Uninvited, annoying guests have no right to speak like that." His voice then turned cold. "I ask you, how many orcs entered the Alder territory? How many came this way to the northwest?" The orc had been punched in the face, blood spurting from his nostrils, his facial hair matted together with blood. He stubbornly insisted, "Human, you won't get me to utter a single word." Brave Aguzer would never betray his own kind. Paul was about to order his men to continue beating him to death when a figure rushed in front of him. It was the mage Durson, who had recently sworn allegiance to him. Before the journey, this fellow had volunteered, insisting on coming along no matter what. "Lord Gleman, please hand over these hairy bastards to me. I will extract every word they know, even their memories from their mother's womb." Paul looked at the mage's hopeful face. This guy seemed extremely eager to prove himself. "Let him give it a try," Mariana suggested to her son. "Durson is a mage specializing in mental magic." Right. His mother's words reminded Paul that this guy should be quite adept at extracting information through torture. "All right, you'll be in charge of interrogating them." Paul's words delighted Durson. "I will certainly satisfy you, Lord Griles." At this moment, the situation on the battlefield changed again. The Orc cavalry on the left and right flanks charged forward, intending to support the central army that was bogged down in a stalemate, but the Orc cavalry on the left and right flanks naturally wouldn't let them succeed, and charged forward to meet them. Chapter 703 Temporary Retreat. Callum frowned, his gaze fixed on the smoke-filled battlefield. The Orc commander, perhaps unaware of his own trembling hands, observed the situation unfolding before him. The enemy infantry remained unbroken, while his own cavalry had lost momentum. The Orc generals surrounding Callum remained silent. Many hoped for a miracle. Perhaps if the fighting continued a little longer, the human phalanx would suddenly crumble? Others wanted to speak but dared not. Their army had advanced westward undefeated, their Orc cavalry invincible against the frail human infantry phalanxes. To say anything discouraging now might displease Callum. Time ticked by, until finally someone broke the silence, shattering the fervor of the crowd. "Continuing like this is pointless. It's no different from being stuck in the mud. We must make them retreat and regroup for a second charge." Seeing someone speak up, the orc generals all breathed a sigh of relief and looked at their commander with questioning eyes. Colin looked at the speaker, his eyes seemingly spitting fire. Just when everyone thought he was about to erupt in anger, the orc commander gritted his teeth and said, "You're right, Grother." Colin commanded sharply, "Make them retreat and regroup. We must draw our bows again and fire our arrows." Actually, Grother's description of them being stuck in the mud was quite euphemistic, because no matter how you looked at it, the orcs were the ones suffering the greater casualties. The ring of corpses surrounding the human phalanx filled the orc generals with both anger and shock. A deafening horn sounded. The experienced Schroeder deduced the orcs' intentions. They're retreating, he immediately ordered, "Get the artillery ready. Once a safe distance is established, return to your positions and fire on the retreating enemy." During the previous attack, the artillerymen had retreated into the nearest phalanx as the enemy approached, leaving their cannons in place. Many orc soldiers tried to destroy these terrifying flamethrowers, but neither the bronze and iron barrels nor the sturdy wooden carriages could be damaged quickly. Moreover, their tools were limited to swords and spears, so they had to give up, leaving the cannons intact. Of course, some powder kegs hadn't been taken with them. A small flame would have destroyed them, but the orc soldiers clearly lacked the knowledge to do so. To cover the retreat of the central cavalry, the orcs' left and right flanks began to move, rapidly advancing towards the Orcish flanks, also cavalry, to prevent the central cavalry from being ambushed and killed during their retreat. In the previous battle, the orc cavalry on the left and right flanks remained motionless, allowing the infantry in the center to be relentlessly attacked by the orc cavalry. Now the orc generals realized that this must be due to the humans' confidence in their infantry phalanx. But as the battle continued, Callum was somewhat puzzled by the human commander's caution. If you were the human commander, facing the situation where the enemy cavalry had lost speed and were locked in close combat with their own infantry, he would have ordered the cavalry on the left and right flanks to flank them, coordinating with the innermost infantry for a coordinated attack from the inside and outside, ensuring that none of the slowed enemy cavalry could escape. Seeing the towering dust raised by the enemy, Catherine realized it was time for her and her men to take the field. And at that moment, Schroeder's signal arrived, blocked the orc cavalry on the left and right flanks. Clang. Catherine drew her sword. "Warriors, remember Sunset Valley, remember this retreat. Today, we will repay the orcs 100-fold for the humiliation of defeat." Princess Alder's voice added fuel to the already raging fire in everyone's hearts. "Kill the orcs, 100-fold repayment." Angry shouts rang out. The Alder cavalry spurred their horses, moving towards the approaching orc cavalry. Compared to the orcs from the plains, the Alder cavalry's formation was more disciplined and compact, even maintaining a roughly straight line while running. The Alder's left flank against the orcs' right flank, and vice versa, four formidable forces quickly clashed. Paul, holding binoculars, nervously watched in Catherine's direction, but the billowing dust severely impaired his vision. She should stay safe, just like me. He was somewhat annoyed, worried about Catherine. "Princess, you're probably too eager for revenge," Mariana explained. "The sense of accomplishment from personally slaying your enemies is indescribable." The red-haired witch was currently in turmoil. Before the battle began, she had prepared to use her power to quickly escape the battlefield with Paul should things turn sour. At that time, Mariana didn't believe the Orcish army could withstand the Orcish attack, even though her son's army seemed more modern. But the battle's progress exceeded her expectations. The army from Arden not only withstood the Orcish cavalry charge but also inflicted heavy casualties. Mariana realized she had underestimated her eldest son. This boy now possessed a powerful force capable of putting him on the chessboard. Holding such a military force would attract covetous eyes. Wouldn't it be terrible if you were seen as a pawn to be used? Mariana was very worried. At this moment, the cavalry on both flanks of the two sides began to attack each other. Meanwhile, the orc cavalry attacking the central formation of the orc army began to retreat. Because the human cavalry were tied down, their retreat was undisturbed. "Quick! Reload!" The Arda artillerymen rushed out of their formations and back to their positions. After a series of rapid maneuvers, the cannons, large and small, finally opened fire again. The artillerymen first bombarded with grape shot, and after the enemy retreated further, they switched to solid shot. Undoubtedly, this dealt another heavy blow to the retreating orc cavalry. "Quick! Reassemble into charge formation." The central cavalry finally returned to their starting point. Callum impatiently gave the order, and the cavalry obeyed. But, whoosh! Whoosh! A barrage of projectiles whistled through the air, landing in the cavalry's assembly area, instantly sending mud and blood flying, and many war horses were thrown to the ground. "Reassemble into charge formation," Callum roared. But after several attempts, he had to give up on getting the warriors to assemble on the spot. "I'm sorry, I've been quite busy for the past 2 weeks, and the update has been delayed for too long." Chapter 704 Failure. They've been defeated. Unable to break through the phalanx, the Orc cavalry retreated in disarray, while the Austro-Hungarian army erupted in a deafening celebration. Many soldiers who had retreated all the way here could hardly believe their eyes. Just moments before, they had been driven solely by sheer courage to fight the enemy, their minds gripped by fear and tension, leaving no room for thought. Only when the dust kicked up by the enemy's hooves receded into the distance did they awaken as if from a dream. Many could not contain their excitement and roared hysterically. Each unit must restrain its soldiers, maintain strict discipline, and no one is allowed to act without orders. Schroeder immediately issued the order to prevent these men from doing anything that would give the enemy an opening. The Northwesterners withstood the Orcish charge. The knights of the capital surrounding Catherine expressed their sincere admiration. They had clearly seen that the Orc cavalry's main target was the 2 northwestern phalanxes in the center, the enemy surrounding and tearing at them like a pack of wolves, their dense attack temporarily obstructing the view of their allies. But the Northwesterners' phalanx stood firm like a stubborn reef, unyielding to the relentless assault of the waves. "Is the Orcs' retreat real?" Catherine frowned. She still remembered how, in the Sunset Valley, it was the Orcs' feigned retreat that lured the Austro-infantry into a rash advance, ultimately becoming the beginning of a series of defeats for the kingdom's army. When the Orc flank cavalry charged, the Royal Knights engaged them briefly. Since the Orcs were only there to cover the main force's retreat, there was no large-scale melee, and they quickly disengaged. Then they received orders from Schroeder to flank and cover the infantry's advance. The Austro-infantry immediately changed formation, from a hollow phalanx to a column, and began to advance, accompanied by artillery. The 3-pound and 6-pound light cannons were pushed forward by manpower, while the heavier artillery was pulled by horses. Because of their coordinated advance with the artillery, the infantry moved relatively slowly, but the heavy metal pipes gave them a strong sense of security. The Central Arda Battalion maintained a very tight formation, which could be easily converted into the previous hollow square. Friendly infantry followed cautiously to their flanks and rear, while cavalry provided cover, moving at the same speed as the infantry, firmly guarding the left and right flanks. The entire Orc army was like a steamroller, heavy and slow, but rolling forward unstoppable. "Left squad is assembling here, Grug." "Reza, I'm here." "Grug is dead." Shouts echoed across the Orc lines, as war horses moved back and forth, carrying their riders searching for their comrades and superiors. The previous failed attack and hasty retreat had left the various cavalry units in disarray. Just as they were regrouping, the advancing Orc army stopped. The artillery was once again within range of the Orcs. Cannons of 6 pounds and below deployed swiftly, while heavy artillery was slower, and the deadly blows immediately fell upon the Orc army. Shells whistled in, focusing on areas where men and horses were packed together. Horses scattered in terror, causing widespread chaos, and the hard-won formation crumbled again. Even the cavalry who could control their horses were forced to disperse, increasing the distance between them to reduce the chance of being hit. The Orcs' morale is gone, their formation has become loose. If our cavalry on both flanks attack simultaneously, we can quickly rout them. Several knights running from the flanks relayed their lord's suggestions to Paul from behind the Orc infantry formation. Paul frowned and asked his chief of staff, "Schroeder, what do you think?" Schroeder swallowed hard. "It involves changing the overall battle plan. You should make the decision." "I'll only handle the details." Paul could sense that his chief of staff implicitly agreed with the suggestion. Leveraging the superior power and range of their firearms, they advanced steadily and cautiously, step by step, until the Orcs could no longer withstand the casualties and withdrew from the battlefield. This was the battle strategy decided before the battle began. While they could only achieve a small victory, for the Orcish army, which had retreated all the way here, even the smallest victory was invaluable. A defeat, on the other hand, would cause the kingdom's army, which had just stabilized, to collapse again, and would be a huge blow to the inexperienced Arda army. Paul needed a victory that was 100% guaranteed, no matter how small. Under such a heavy burden, he hated anything outside the plan. But he raised his binoculars, the small lens revealing the situation on the enemy's position. When the orcs first arrived, their army was well organized, their fighting spirit high, their momentum overwhelming, a sight to behold. But now they were chaotic and disorganized. Perhaps they still maintained their fighting spirit, but more so, they were restless and impatient due to the inability to achieve victory. Annihilating this cavalry would sever the orcs' claws reaching into the northwest. The temptation was too great. Paul's fingers tapped lightly on the binoculars, his heart in turmoil. Time ticked by, until the Orcish horns sounded again on the battlefield. They launched their second charge. "All right, gentlemen, go back and tell your superiors to proceed according to the original plan." Paul's hesitation had squandered a potential opportunity. The lords who had offered suggestions shook their heads in disappointment upon receiving the reply. He ultimately lacked the necessary decisiveness, squandering a good opportunity. "Our commander has lost a chance to shine in history books. Earl Giles, though young, is excessively cautious than some of the old men," the lords complained as they directed their soldiers to meet the Orcish cavalry's second charge. But this time, they were undoubtedly much more relaxed. Deploying the artillery forward and bombarding the enemy was the right thing to do. Although the orcs were bloodshot and each one was fierce, their hasty formation under the threat of artillery fire meant their offensive lacked the tightness and discipline of the previous attack. Out of caution, the orc infantry hastily switched to hollow square formation. Bayonets, flaming guns, and firing, soldiers in different platoons performed their duties. The enemy cavalry circled them again and again, ultimately retreating with a ring of corpses. The second attack was repelled once more. But only the orcs' attacks on the orcs ceased. The orcs' attacks on the orcs did not. The artillery resumed firing, shells relentlessly pursuing the enemy until they exceeded their maximum range. "General, please select a group of the bravest warriors to accompany me on one last attack." The orc warrior Wardler, brandishing the sword bestowed upon him by Callum, stormed before his commander in a fit of rage. 2 consecutive failed attacks had eroded the morale of his comrades, leaving them deeply demoralized. Wardler was furious, seeing these men as cowards. When he rebuked them, he was immediately met with a retort: "Since you're so brave, why didn't you charge into the hail of human bayonets? If you had, we would have followed you without hesitation." Wardler was speechless. Was it his fault? He wasn't afraid to die, but persuading his 4-legged beast to bravely sacrifice itself was too difficult. The horse turned tail and ran away as soon as it saw the gleaming bayonets. Chapter 705 Victory. Looking at Wardler, whose fighting spirit remained high, Callum felt an indescribable pain in his heart. This time, as the commander, he was about to let down a steppe warrior like Wardler. 2 consecutive cavalry charges had failed to achieve the desired effect. Although the thick smoke obscured the battlefield, Callum learned the true situation from the returning soldiers. Few enemies had been killed, but many had perished. The bodies of warhorses and warriors formed a circle around the human formation. "Wardler, we can't continue like this," Callum said bitterly. What? Wardler's eyes widened, almost unable to believe what he was hearing. His commander, since leading the army into Alder, had been invincible, sweeping all before him and establishing great achievements. They were almost at the edge of the sea. How could they give up because of this small setback? This westward advancing orc army was all from the Grey Wolf tribe, not a core part of the Royal Tent's power structure. But if they could bring the entire northwestern region of the Alder Kingdom under their control, the Grey Wolf clan's status within the royal court would undoubtedly rise significantly. Wardler was still in a daze when Callum cracked his whip. "Let Warwick lead his troops as the rear guard, Lord Callum." "Just once, let me try again," Wardler pleaded. "Wardler," the orc commander sternly rebuked him. "Now is not the time for rash actions. We cannot let the steppe warriors sacrifice themselves in vain until we find a way to counter them." He extended his large, warm hand and grasped Wardler's. "Trust me. Soon we will be able to settle things with them, chasing those humans until we see the sea." It seems the orcs are really withdrawing from the battlefield. On a slightly elevated hill, Schroeder and his men assessed the enemy's movements. The infantry phalanxes were still advancing steadily under the cover of cavalry. They left a small rear guard. "Perhaps we should launch a cavalry attack to inflict greater casualties," he suggested to Paul, his voice tinged with hope. "All right, this time," Paul agreed. When the news reached the left and right flanks, the cavalrymen were filled with excitement. Since the main role of the cavalry was to cover the infantry phalanx on the flanks, Many had served as spectators throughout the battle. At the beginning of the battle, they were filled with worry and anxiety about the strength of the orc cavalry, but as the enemy's offensive faltered and the advantage shifted to the orcs, their competitive spirit inevitably took hold. Once the order was given, the orc cavalry, like fighting dogs released from their cages, eagerly charged towards the orc rearguard. Human cavalry is here, how dare they? Form ranks, wipe them out. The orc rearguard cavalry were astonished, their anger rising as they prepared to teach the enemy a lesson. However, that chilling whistling sound rang out again. Dozens of orc cannons roared, unleashing deadly firepower upon the rearguard cavalry, forcing them to scatter. "Damn it," roared Borak, the orc general in charge of the rearguard. "How are we supposed to fight like this?" Just then, a cannonball struck the ground to his side, splashing dirt all over his face with such force that it burned his entire face. Borak wiped the dirt off his face, thankful for his good fortune. But by then, the orc cavalry was closing in. The Arda artillery stopped firing in time. If the Arda infantry had been on the offensive, the artillery support could have continued for several rounds, but unfortunately, the cavalry from the capital and other territories lacked coordination training with the Arda artillery, and to avoid friendly fire, they dared not do so. The rearguard orc cavalry hurriedly began to regroup, but it seemed a little too late against the orc cavalry, who had already begun their high-speed charge. The orc cavalry charged in like a clenched fist, while the orcs remained a disorganized mob. But the orcs were not to be underestimated. They used their superior horsemanship to maneuver against the orc cavalry, and their lighter equipment gave them an advantage in agility. Derek Keller and Garrett Ferdinand, fully armed, rode close together, one wielding a mace, the other a longsword. As the younger generation of their respective families, they had both longed since childhood for the day they could ride across the battlefield, dreaming of one day becoming knights of the kingdom, training at Watcher's Fortress, slaying orcs and barbarians. But they never imagined that this dream would come true on their own doorstep. The two young men knew each other, and while there was a hint of rivalry, they cooperated well, leading their respective family knights, covering each other as they charged through the orc cavalry. The battle wasn't fierce. The orc cavalry's mission was to cover the main force's retreat, so they fought and retreated, ultimately using their superior horsemanship to escape the orc cavalry's pursuit and head east. The orcs had achieved a complete victory, the first time since their defeat at Sunset Valley that they had defeated a large orc army on the battlefield with a fair and square force. Long live victory! A chorus of enthusiastic shouts erupted as everyone desperately expressed their excitement. Many embraced, tears streaming down their faces. "Congratulations, hero of the kingdom." After the commanders of each unit gathered, Catherine kissed her fiancé in front of everyone. The suddenness of the kiss caused Paul's face to flush red, eliciting laughter from the crowd. Later, the battlefield was cleared. The Austrian army suffered 313 dead, 132 wounded, 2,235 orcs killed, 813 captured, and 1,045 war horses seized. The stark exchange ratio shocked everyone. Everyone had assumed they had just experienced a brutal battle, but their casualties were surprisingly low. "Your Majesty," in the Radiant Palace, a servant rushed into the king's study, his agitation bordering on barging in. Please don't bring me any bad news." The young king, who was writing at his desk, looked up, his brows furrowed. The orc invasion was already enough to give him a headache. "No, it's good news, yes," the attendant almost shouted. "The kingdom's army has won a victory in the northwest." He then presented a piece of paper. Thanks to the telegraph line extending from the northwest to Crystal Radiance, news of the victory on the Ursula Plains reached Crystal Radiance within half a day. Rodney's eyes widened. "It's Gleman. Victory. Another victory, God bless." The king excitedly stood up from his seat and snatched the letter from the attendant's hand. He unfolded it and eagerly read its contents. Orc cavalry approached, and the orc army stood ready, forming phalanxes to resist the enemy's charge. The orcs' attack was unsuccessful and they suffered heavy casualties, forcing them to withdraw from the battlefield. The process was quite simple, and the king was pleased but also somewhat disappointed. It wasn't a decisive annihilation, but it was enough. At this moment, another attendant entered. "Your Majesty, Prince Jassim has just returned after completing his negotiations with the orcs." Chapter 706 Showdown. "Father, what did you say?" Besides the king and his father, there was no one else in the study. Rodney's eye trembled violently. The news Prince Jassim had reported to him had deeply shocked him. Jassim Rodney, as his plenipotentiary representative, had ceded all of the kingdom's territory north of the Cordoba River, encompassing almost the entire northern and northeastern regions, to the orcs in exchange for peace. It felt like a sharp dagger piercing his heart. He swayed and sat down unsteadily. "I had no choice," Prince Jassim said calmly. "The kingdom's army has been utterly defeated. Even if we stand firm on paper, those places are already effectively under orc control." The king abruptly stood up, his eyes blazing with fury as he looked at the prince. "But if we don't sign the agreement, we can send troops to take them back." Jassim was startled by his son's attitude. In his memory, his eldest son had never been so disobedient. Even after becoming king, he had always been respectful. "Your dear sister failed to turn the tide and led the elite troops of Crystal Radiance to who knows where. The Orcish army has swept across the north, and now the Plenty Plains, the heart of the kingdom, is almost facing the onslaught of the Orcish army." Rodney's VIE raised the letter in his hand, arguing vehemently, "No, she's in the northwest, and she defeated the orcs with the army there." Jassim glanced at the letter contemptuously. Rodney's VIE had excitedly shown him its contents when he entered. "A negligible victory?" The king was furious. "How can you say that?" The prince didn't even lift an eyelid. "You're too young. Generals fighting abroad love to exaggerate their achievements. Killing 100 enemies can be blown out of proportion to 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000. Did it say that the Orcish army withdrew from the battlefield on its own? They didn't achieve a single victory that could have turned the tide of the war." The king trembled. "No matter what, as king of Alder, I cannot agree to such a ceasefire agreement. If I do, what face will the Rodney family have to rule this country?" His tone was resolute. "Alice," Jassim sighed sadly. His eldest son's attitude towards the agreement was not unexpected. "Listen to me, Gerd." He called out his son's name, then hesitated. Rodney's VIE sat there angrily, not looking at him. "Do you want us to bear the stigma of usurpers?" Rodney's VIE was taken aback, then looked at his father. "What did you say?" Jassim whispered. "To help your uncle relieve himself of that heavy burden as soon as possible, I made an agreement with certain people or organizations. Of course, I only plan to use their power someday in the future. I haven't done anything substantial yet. I swore to the Lord of Light that this was true. But now, that agreement has become a handle for others to use." Rodney's VIE's brows furrowed tightly. A terrible premonition exploded in his heart. But he still said, "What are you saying? I don't quite understand." The prince stared intently at him. "There's a vast organization, the Arcane Society. Its tentacles reach across this continent beneath our feet. It possesses magical power and incredible methods, and I, in a moment of confusion, was bewitched by them." He slowly recounted a long-forgotten story, and Rodney's VIE listened with a growing shock. "Now, these damned bastards have actually made contact with the orcs, appearing while I was negotiating with Avar, forcing me to sign a treaty destined to bring shame." After the prince finished speaking, a long silence fell over the study. Rodney's VIE sat motionless behind the desk, his heart churning with turmoil. He knew his father had always harbored ambitions for the throne, but that was all right. Anyone with Rodney blood should be prepared to inherit great responsibilities. He himself had even been a supporter of his father. But the so-called letting his uncle unload that heavy burden as soon as possible was clearly a veiled expression of something extremely inappropriate. Father just said he hadn't done anything substantial. Was that true? But why did Uncle's health decline so rapidly in the last few years of his life? Gerd Rodney had always trusted his father, but now he felt he needed to re-evaluate this closest relative. Once the seed of doubt was planted, it began to take root, sprout, and grow. After a long silence, the king asked softly, "Do they have any irrefutable evidence?" "If it's just some," but Prince Jassim nodded grimly. "Unfortunately, they do." "But, my child," he suddenly raised his head, his eyes gleaming as he looked at the king. "Everything I did was for you, your crown, your glory. You can gather your ministers and pin everything on me, that won't diminish your authority." Rodney's VIE looked at his father with a complex expression and let out a long sigh. If it really was some kind of evidence of treason, there seemed to be no good way to deal with it. If that so-called secret society were to release the evidence, the four of them would be finished. "Father," he spoke, but solemnly, "I could never do that." A glimmer of light appeared in the prince's eyes. "But," Rodney's VIE said resolutely, "some things must change." The prince's brow furrowed again. "Many things I wanted to do before, So many things, were all stopped by you with inappropriate reasons. The king waved his arms, appearing somewhat agitated, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. Yet we have already lost the south in fact, and now even most of the north is gone. The once prosperous and powerful Ulder, with its vast territory, is now reduced to its royal domain and a bunch of fragmented lands, loyal only in name. I am now quite certain that Ulder is a stagnant pool reeking of decay. If no changes are made, a shameful demise awaits it sooner or later. Therefore, he stared at the prince, his tone leaving no room for doubt. From now on, I will exist as a true king. Both father and son saw an unfamiliar side of each other. Very well, your majesty. Prince Jassim slumped weakly into his chair. Do as you see fit. Chapter 707 Marcus Gleman. When Earl Morin finished reading the king's decree, the crowd's anger erupted almost immediately. How could such a treaty be signed, such a vast swath of land in the north, just given away to orcs and traitors like that? What about Watcher's fortress? Amidst the clamor, Catherine's face was pale, her bloodless lips moving, wanting to speak but unable to utter a word. Just moments before, the crowd had been arguing endlessly about the next course of action. Some advocated a rapid advance eastward to quickly reclaim the kingdom's lost territory. Others advocated a steady, methodical approach, gradually wearing down the orcs' strength, as in the last battle. But Earl Morin, the king's special envoy, arrived with a bombshell message. Faced with the crowd's questions, Earl Morin's face was also extremely grim. Gentlemen, even now, I am as shocked as you are. At the Royal Council, the king suddenly announced this decision, citing the reason that if the war with the orcs continues, Giles and Vedlin will join forces to attack Crystal Radiance. In fact, the Earl himself didn't quite believe this reason, because as the kingdom's chief intelligence officer, he hadn't received any related information. Did His Majesty have other intelligence channels abroad? Sure enough, this reason didn't convince everyone. Although there is this risk, we cannot simply give up such a large piece of land. If the orcs occupy the north of the kingdom, our generation will become sinners. Gentlemen, please be quiet. Amidst the crowd's indignation, Earl Morin took out a second parchment scroll, the gold-edged patterns indicating that it was another royal decree. The Earl looked at Paul Gleman, who sat at the head of the table. Even after he had just announced such shocking news, the young man remained silent. Earl Gleman, the king's envoy, looked at him solemnly. Paul realized that the second decree was related to him and slowly stood up. Earl Morin read the contents of the edict clearly and solemnly. Silence fell upon the room once more. The shock of its contents was no less than the earlier ceding of territory to the orcs for peace. Paul Gleman had been promoted to Marcus by the king. In the aristocratic culture of Alder, a Marcus was more than just a title, it carried a powerful connotation, a frontier military leader. While slightly lower in status than a duke, a marquis's influence was no less, especially in military matters. Theoretically, he even had the power to mobilize troops within a duchy. Only a handful of founding ministers had ever held the title of Marcus, and after their deaths, no one else had held it. And now, this title, which had disappeared for centuries, had reappeared on the kingdom's historical stage. The atmosphere in the room was ignited by the edict's contents: jealousy, envy, admiration, expectation. The lords murmured amongst themselves, a myriad of emotions flashing across their faces. Shocked, Paul didn't know how to react until he felt his arm being pinched. Catherine pulled him back to reality. Paul quickly composed himself and solemnly said, I accept this heavy responsibility with utmost humility and swear to dedicate my life to the Alder with all my limited abilities. He extended both hands and respectfully accepted the decree from Earl Morin. A Marquis, everyone present fell into thought. What was the king's intention? The anger ignited by the humiliating terms of the previous treaty had largely dissipated. Negotiating peace while simultaneously appointing a military leader, and a rather capable one at that, the king's contradictory actions seemed to indicate that the conflict between the Alder and the orcs was far from over. A simple banquet was held in the camp to celebrate the birth of a Marcus. After the banquet, Earl Morin found Paul and Catherine and deliberately chose a secluded spot to speak with them. Earl Gleman, no, Marcus Gleman. His Majesty needs your help, the Earl said bluntly. Me, Paul pointed to himself. What kind of help do you need? Count Morin replied, help in every way possible. His Majesty has decided to use your Alda as a model to carry out a top-down, comprehensive reform of the entire kingdom. Paul's heart skipped a beat. His long-standing actions were finally about to have a huge impact on the country. In an instant, Countless thoughts surged through his mind. What should he do? Help Rodney's VIE carry out reforms and make Aldo prosperous? Admittedly, Rodney's VIE was a good person, but he was unwilling. He was the transmigrator, he should be the protagonist guiding the tide of the times. Perhaps he should take advantage of the royal family's current extreme weakness, rebel? Head south, strike at Crystal Radiance, and place the crown on his own head. Alice, what about Catherine? Paul, Catherine once again brought her fiancé, lost in his fantasies, back to reality. Ahem. Excuse me, I'm astonished by the king's foresight. Yes, Aldo has no choice but to change. His Majesty is truly wise. The Marquis's flattery was nauseating, and Earl Morin decided to ignore it. His Majesty needs you on the frontier, but he also needs you in Crystal Radiance. I hope you can first go to the capital to discuss the reform strategy with His Majesty, and then return to build a powerful army. As many have thought, the peace with the orcs is only temporary. Sooner or later, we will drive them back to the plains to eat sand. After informing the king of his intentions, Earl Morin returned to his residence shortly after, leaving Paul and Catherine alone. Congratulations, Catherine could clearly feel that Paul was becoming increasingly important to her. When Paul was made a Marquis, she was genuinely happy for him and deeply proud. Of course, it would have been even better if that disgusting and humiliating peace treaty hadn't been there. If she were still the princess she once was, she would probably have immediately led her army back to Crystal Glory and demanded to know the realities upon which those who made the decision in the capital had based their treaty. But she was different now. She didn't know when it started, but Catherine's mindset had slowly changed. Her former fervor had begun to fade, and that optimistic, positive spirit for the future had vanished. She could still swear absolute loyalty to the kingdom of Aldo, but that loyalty had become a kind of dear best and leave the rest to fake kind of loyalty. Perhaps this change began the day her father passed away. Thank you, Paul replied with a smile. His calm tone surprised Catherine. In fact, she had been wondering about it for a while. Whether it was the humiliating contract or the glorious title, Paul was the most composed person present today. How deep must this man's thoughts be? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 708 Old Stories. The candlelight flickered, casting the shadows of the two women onto the white wall. Laddie, you seem troubled, Paul's mother, Marianne Gleman, inquired with concern about her former student, Laddie Sisha Gerard, a female spellcaster from Horn Bay. Since their unexpected reunion in Alden not long ago, the two had often spent time together, reminiscing about the past or discussing magical matters. Of course, Marianne, or rather Mrs. Gleman, also learned about her son and the many events that had occurred in Alda through her student. With each new piece of information she gathered, Mrs. Gleman gained a new impression of her eldest son. Laddie, however, harbored resentment towards her teacher. After guiding her and her senior, Helen, onto the path of magic, why had her teacher disappeared? For so long, there had been no news of her, leading her to wonder if her teacher had met with some evil cult. Then, she reappeared in a completely unexpected guise. The high-ranking members of the Arcane Society, and Paul Grile's mother. Fate was so ingenious that Laddie wondered if she was living in a fabricated story. But as their interactions increased, the misunderstanding between them gradually dissipated. Laddie Sisha quickly grasped Mariana's intention. If a student knew that a revered teacher was a member of the Arcane Society, this fact might have influenced her independent judgment when the organization extended an invitation to her long ago. Mariana wanted her to choose her own path without interference. Hearing her teacher's concerned inquiry, a bitter feeling welled up in Laddie Sisha's heart. No, she answered rather stubbornly. Mariana smiled. I can see that you have something special about that boy. How? She changed her tone and asked cautiously. He bullied you. Mariana knew that Paul was engaged to the kingdom's princess, but she worried that Paul might have done something outrageous, abandoning his former lover for the sake of climbing the social ladder, or something like that. No, absolutely not, Laddie Sisha denied firmly. No? You don't need to hide anything for him, really, no, please believe me, teacher. Laddie carefully chose her words, afraid of causing Marianne to misunderstand. Lord Griles and I only reached a spiritual resonance because of certain shared views. As she spoke, a blush appeared on her face. Marianne sighed. My dear laddie, whatever your spiritual resonance may be, as someone who has been through it all, I must offer you young people some advice. Laddie's face darkened. She seemed to already understand what her teacher was about to say. The union of a mortal and a spellcaster will never end well. Sure enough, Mariana said sternly, the pressures from both religion and secular society will plunge you into suffering, and as your mother and teacher, I don't want you to endure that pain. She even cited Helen as an example. It was Helen and her sister's bloodline that brought war upon her husband's country. But, wasn't teacher Mariana also? Laddie murmured softly, her voice tinged with resentment. Yes, it's precisely because I've not only seen it, but also experienced it firsthand, that I don't want you to repeat that suffering. Mariana's eyes suddenly welled up with tears, which Laddie found unbelievable. She had never seen her powerful teacher Mariana like this before. Do you know how I've endured these past years? The pain of being separated from my loved ones for over a decade has been agonizing. Even, she seemed to suddenly break down, tears streaming down her face like a burst dam. Even when Paul's father passed away, I couldn't be by his side, couldn't see him off on his final journey. Laddie stepped forward and hugged her weeping teacher, gently stroking her back as if comforting a child. I'm sorry, I've stirred up your painful memories. It's all right, I was just feeling sentimental. It came quickly, and it went quickly, as if suddenly, the powerful and resolute witch returned, her delicate face regaining its usual haughtiness and coldness. She was completely different from her previous fragile self, only her reddened eyes revealed her earlier loss of composure. Laddie said in a reassuring tone, please rest assured, teacher. I am now Lord Gleman's subject, and he is my lord. I hold in him the loyalty and reverence a subject has for their lord. Marianne looked at her with suspicion, but still said, people can control their desires. You are different from Helen. You have always been a rational and calm person. I hope you will choose your path carefully. The teacher and student continued to talk for a long time, even talking about Marianne's past. Laddie casually asked, how did you meet old Lord Griles? It's all old news. Back then, he was a hot-blooded and impulsive young man who, under the instigation of his friends, went on an adventure alone deep in the forest. As she spoke of this, Marianne's resolve softened. Legend has it that a witch lived in seclusion deep in the forest. This witch had a magical crystal ball, and Hart planned to steal the crystal ball to prove his courage. The teacher's eyes revealed a sense of reminiscence, which Laddie could see despite her attempts to hide it, and she couldn't help but ask curiously, and then, the red-haired woman slightly turned her head to hide a smile playing on her lips. He failed. He couldn't steal the witch's crystal ball, and then, he stole the witch's heart. Elsewhere, Paul looked at the map hanging on the wall with a troubled expression, surrounded by high-ranking generals like Schroeder and Bryce. During the day, he had refrained from judgment in front of the king's envoy, but now, surrounded by his confidants, he could speak his mind without restraint. To be honest, I can't believe Jingai could do something so outrageous. The others didn't understand his meaning, but it was clearly not a compliment. Paul asked them, if we continue our eastward advance, can we drive the orcs back to the grasslands? What did that mean? Wasn't this a slap in the face to Jingai? It seemed quite exciting. The generals seriously discussed the possibility. After a while, Schroeder was the first to shake his head. The main force of the orcs is currently deployed to the south. Without the southern armies restrained, the main orc force will soon turn northwest. Without the royal family's influence, even our allies might hesitate. Of those present, Schroeder was the most heartbroken. As a knight from Watcher's fortress, it wasn't hard to imagine how he felt about the place he had fought for half his life falling into Orcish hands. The other generals echoed Schroeder's sentiments. All right, Paul resigned himself. Let's continue our garrison for a while, monitoring the Orcish army across the way. It wouldn't be good if they broke the agreement and attacked us during our retreat. Chapter 709 Changes on the West Coast. I don't expect your understanding. But please believe me, I must have my reasons. In the reception room of the palace, Rodney's VIE said to everyone with a face full of guilt, as for the reasons, it's not convenient to reveal them for now. Those sitting there included Paul, Catherine, and Myron Garnard, who had always been by the king's side as a member of the Special District Management Committee. Your Majesty, will our conflict with the orcs end here? Paul asked him. After stabilizing the situation in the northwest, at the king's urging, Paul and Catherine had rushed to Crystal Radiance, where Rodney's VIE wanted to give him a betrothal ceremony. Of course not. 5 years, Rodney's VIE frowned deeply, opening his palms. At most 5 years, and the older army will once again stand atop Watcher's fortress. The king spoke with unwavering resolve. The humiliating peace treaty with the orcs had dealt a heavy blow to his prestige, and Rodney's VIE now felt like he was sitting on a volcano every moment. I will organize a great army. He clenched his fist and waved it in the air. The Arda army is an excellent model. The king looked at Paul with great interest. I have learned in detail about your battles against the orcs, and I must say that the Arda army played a crucial role. Your forces are a model for all the kingdom's armies. Paul nodded slightly. I am deeply honored to receive such praise from your majesty. However, I also understand that maintaining an army like Arda requires a great deal of money. Even if we have military scrip, we still need matching exchangeable resources. Rodney's VIE turned his gaze to Myron. Therefore, our reforms cannot be limited to small-scale operations in the special economic zone, but must be rolled out comprehensively, throughout the entire royal domain, and even in other territories loyal to the royal family. Myron stood up. Your Majesty, I will do my utmost. Paul thought to himself, it seems he and the king get along well. Since the establishment of the Special Economic Zone centered on Westport, it has been operating smoothly, and the management committee has established many factories following the model of the Northwest Bay. Paper making, salt production, timber processing, coke making. In fact, apart from a few new industries, many industries had existed in Aldo for hundreds or even thousands of years, but they existed in the form of scattered small workshops and handicrafts. The Special Administrative Region Management Committee introduced new organizational forms, new production technologies, and so-called standardization from the Western Bay, thus establishing large-scale production units called workshops. The most important of these was the textile industry. The high efficiency of the spinning jenny and flying shuttle loom attracted a large number of wealthy people to join this industry. With a huge influx of private capital, textile factories sprang up one after another, and the abundant water power in the south of the kingdom provided a continuous power source for the machines in the factories. These factories attracted a large number of workers to make a living. In Aldo's previous lower class, the number of workers, craftsmen, was negligible compared to the huge peasant population, but now the situation began to change. Traditionally, Aldo cities were merely distribution centers for goods from the surrounding rural areas. Most of the city's supplies relied on these rural markets, and the population was small, often only 10 or 20,000 people. However, within the special economic zones, this changed. With the influx of workers, the cities grew larger and larger. The rise of new industries transformed cities from distribution centers into production centers. To put it bluntly, the scattered handicraft workshops in the countryside were destroyed by city factories, and the countryside was reduced to a mere source of raw materials. Bankrupt rural artisans were forced to relocate to the cities to seek a living, and factory owners, struggling with labor shortages, welcomed their arrival, particularly evident in the textile industry. The rise of the textile industry had another significant impact. The enormous demand for raw materials, cotton and wool, caused their prices to skyrocket. Cotton deserves special mention, as the cotton gin, invented in the Northwest Bay, was brought south. This powerful machine consisted of a cylindrical body with numerous steel teeth mounted on its walls. As the cylinder rotated, the teeth forcibly tore the cotton fibers from the seeds, using centrifugal force to filter out the seeds and discard the cotton fibers. Powered by water, one person operating the gin could separate more cotton in a single day than it would take several months of manual labor. Moreover, it was easy to operate, requiring only one person per machine, and was far cleaner than manual picking. The textile industry's booming demand for raw materials led to a dramatic shift in surrounding agricultural production. Combined with advanced agricultural technology and machinery also from the Western Bay, this significantly reduced the need for manual labor per unit of land. With little spare land available for cultivation near the densely populated capital and Westport, rural populations further migrated to cities. This influx of people placed immense pressure on the special zone's public infrastructure. Because it was an experimental project, the kingdom's government's support for the special zone was limited. The committee had to entrust the Northwest Bank, developed from a bank originally established by the Alda Council, to issue bonds to obtain funds for public infrastructure development. Roads, bridges, factories, dormitories, residences, new buildings are constantly under construction in the West Harbor Special Economic Zone, changing every day. The booming maritime trade has solved the sales problem for goods within the zone, and driven by the Northwest Bay, more and more coastal cities are joining in. With continuous technological iteration, the sailing ships built in the Northwest Bay are becoming larger, stronger, and with greater cargo capacity, strongly supporting the growth of the trade chain. The ever-growing trade chain begins in the Northwest Bay, extending north to the territories of the Forest Orcs, including the Tranquil Plains, Lucky Forest, and Blackwater Basin, and south to cover the entire western coast of Walder. Turning east through Horn Bay, it passes through the subcontinent of Asar under the control of the papacy, continuing to extend to the eastern end of the continent, and even establishing contact with the land inhabited by elves in the southeast of the continent. The voyages of Waldo merchant ships, like threads, connected the various civilizations of the continent that had previously had very little interaction. Centralized production and the immense cargo capacity of maritime transport made Aldo's goods both high quality and inexpensive. While this impacted the local, underdeveloped handicrafts, it also gained popularity among the locals. The merchant ships returned laden with local specialties and cultural artifacts. Through trade, the residents of Waldo's coastal cities broadened their horizons significantly, leading to a flourishing of local culture and a rapid development of the publishing industry, especially in the Northwest Bay where literacy rates were rapidly increasing. With the advancements in papermaking and printing, not only did novels and poetry proliferate, but newspapers, primarily for publishing news and current affairs commentary, were also invented by the people themselves. Chapter 710 Polite Refusal. Fortunately, our army's recruitment has begun, Rodney's VIE said with a hint of relief. This prevents the surrounding villains from taking advantage of the kingdom's recent defeat. He looked at Paul with gratitude. Thanks to the large amount of military scrip transported from the Western Bay, a steady stream of strong young men is entering the kingdom's army. I must say, Paul, your idea was brilliant. It has been a great success. Paul nodded. Your Majesty, I am pleased that it has worked as expected, the king continued. During your absence, 2 large camps were built outside Crystal City, one in the south and one in the north. My initial plan is to train a standing army of 50,000 men. 50,000 men standing, Catherine exclaimed. That's a huge number. Yes, the king nodded. Without military scrip, this would have been unimaginable before. Previously, the kingdom's army maintained only an elite force composed of noble sons and knights in peacetime, and then temporarily conscripted soldiers to form a larger army during wartime. Catherine shook her head. But in my opinion, even with military scrip, it would be difficult to obtain. After all, military scrip requires a large amount of matching supplies. Moreover, those officers won't be satisfied with just necessities, their compensation must be in real metal currency. The king adopted a serious expression. You're right, that's exactly what I'm trying to achieve with these reforms, Paul interjected. As far as I know, the economic zone centered on Westport has been remarkably successful. Hasn't it brought some benefit to the kingdom's finances? Oh, well, the king hesitated for a moment. The economic zone has greatly benefited the kingdom, but the kingdom's deficit was already quite large. The benefits from the zone have only covered the previous deficit. Oh, Rodney's VIE suddenly rubbed his forehead in pain. Now that the North has lost a large territory, it's easy to imagine that a large number of nobles will come to join Crystal Radiance, just like those loyalists who came from the South because of Giles's rebellion. It took a lot of effort to settle them back then. He suddenly stood up from the sofa, seemingly full of energy, and hope returned to his face. I hereby announce that from this moment forward, I will appoint you, he pointed to Paul, Marcus Paul Gleman. You will serve as the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Waldo, and will dedicate yourself to promoting reforms throughout the kingdom. Everyone present was shocked by these words. Paul stood up with a troubled expression. What about Lord Rupert? Oh, I appreciate his great contributions to the kingdom, but to be honest, he is indeed getting on in years. Your Majesty, I thank you for your trust, but please forgive me for finding it difficult to accept such a heavy responsibility. Rodney's VIE frowned. Why? Paul replied firmly, with my limited intelligence and mediocre abilities, I may be able to manage a territory, but I am simply incapable of shouldering the burden of the entire kingdom. The king was silent for a moment, clearly displeased with his words. What if I insist on appointing you, Your Majesty? I understand your eagerness, but please don't act rashly, Paul said sincerely. The complex political environment in Orda is simply beyond the comprehension of an outsider like myself from the frontier. Assigning me such an important position rashly would only make things worse, Rodney's VIE retorted discontentedly. When faced with difficulties, just solve them. Can I interpret your words as shirking responsibility? As a sword-wielding noble whose fate is intertwined with the kingdom's, shouldn't you rise to the challenge? Seeing the atmosphere between the two becoming tense, Catherine quickly stood up to smooth things over. Your Majesty, if we are to reclaim the kingdom's lands occupied by the orcs in the future, the Northwest Bay will need to be developed into a large military camp to serve as the departure point and logistical base for the future army. As things stand, there is no one more suitable than Paul. The king fell silent again, and after a long while, sighed. Well, Catherine is right. He looked at Paul helplessly. You slippery eel, you should stay where you're best suited. Paul gave his fiancée a grateful look. But, Rodney's VIE raised his voice again. Starting today, I will also establish a reform advisory group, and you will be my chief advisor. This is an order that cannot be revoked. You must accept it, Paul Gleman, or you will be defying the crown on my head. Paul placed his hand on his chest and bowed slightly. I am honored to accept your Majesty's appointment. It's just giving advice, as long as he's not put on the spot. Rodney's VIE secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Paul continued, however, the opinions I can offer may be fragmented, unsystematic, or even outdated. Whether they can be truly implemented requires careful consideration by your Majesty and wise men of similar intelligence. The king smiled somewhat helplessly. You're quite the unyielding one. Don't worry, I won't restrict you for too long. What you need to do in Crystal Radiance is to write down everything you can think of, big or small, to provide ideas for future reforms. Then you can return to the Western Bay to prepare for war. Yes, right, Rodney's VIE added. Crystal Radiance's new army will be trained according to the Alda army model. Paul, I hope you can send a group of people over to impart your experience, of course, and weapons. Rodney's VIE smiled. I've read the report. Your firearms are extremely powerful. It would be wonderful if the kingdom's army could be equipped with them. At a time like this, I hope you won't hold back. And it's not like I'm asking you to hand it over for nothing. You guys are involved in that. Northwest Industries, right? As Alder's largest arms supplier, the kingdom's government will buy from you at a fixed price. Paul breathed a sigh of relief, but then asked with lingering concern, I hope the patent protection also applies to, of course. Rodney's VIE confirmed before he could finish. Paul finally relaxed. Yes, Your Majesty, Northwest Industries will do its utmost to cooperate with you in building the new kingdom's army. Like other technologies, the proliferation of firearms is inevitable. Rather than waiting for others to steal them secretly, it's better to foster an order that benefits us. Chapter 711 Northern 3 Regions. Since the exploration fleet heading north illuminated the map of the coastal area north of the Rocky Mountains, the Arda Council of Government began investing massive resources in its development. This vast virgin land was unsurprisingly considered the new territory of the Griles family. Covered in dense primeval forests, countless precious mineral deposits lay hidden within, along with fertile black soil. To leave this land undeveloped would be a waste. The native tribes here, primarily forest beastmen, did not have the same strict territorial consciousness as humans in civilized nations, and were even less so than their kin on the grasslands. Products that could greatly improve their quality of life, such as delicious refined salt, sturdy ironware, brightly colored fabrics, and exquisite porcelain, could be exchanged for their recognition of ownership of large tracts of land. And it wasn't just land, labor could also be easily obtained. Adhering to the principle instructed by Earl Paul Griles to avoid conflict with the local tribes as much as possible, the development teams often chose lands that the forest beastmen considered worthless as their bases. They felled towering trees, drained swamps, and drove away dangerous beasts, building fortresses, farms, and workshops in places once considered uninhabitable with a speed that astonished the natives. The exploration and mining of underground minerals were also underway, and the local coal production was sufficient to sustain the development team through winters even colder than those in the Western Bay. To many forest orcs, the changes brought about by the arrival of humans seemed like a miracle. Were those tall, sturdy buildings, the astonishingly large farmlands, and the workshops producing exquisite artifacts truly creations of mortal beings? Mysterious legends about the Arda people began to circulate among the various native tribes. However, Some audacious individuals attempted to investigate or even seize the land through brutal means, but they were invariably met with fierce resistance. Compared to the forest orcs, who remained almost entirely in a primitive state, the Arda development team's technological advantage was undeniably overwhelming. The forest orcs might be just as brave as their steppe counterparts, but their wooden clubs and stone spears couldn't penetrate steel armor, their leather couldn't withstand swords and crossbows, and their organization was questionable. Overall, their fighting strength was even weaker than that of bandits in human kingdoms. After eliminating a few ringleaders, the Arda established their reputation in this wild land, and those with ill intentions settled down, honestly trading furs, herbs, and various mountain delicacies with humans. The forest orcs weren't completely isolated, their steppe counterparts would periodically send caravans to trade with them, and the dwarven clans of western Loki Mountain would occasionally descend to do business. Salt, cloth, ironware, and grain were all sought-after commodities here. However, the steppe orcs mostly brought discarded, second-hand goods, while the Loki dwarves, those seemingly honest but actually ruthless dwarves, curse them, often sold their goods at exorbitant prices. Until the Arda arrived, the goods they traded were of far superior quality to the junk found on the plains, and priced far lower than those of the Rocky Mountain dwarves. These inexpensive and high-quality human goods quickly won over almost every indigenous tribe they could reach. Relying on trade and force, the Arda gradually established over 20 trading posts along the coastline of this vast and primitive land. Through long-term deployment and settlement of personnel, and the continuous influx of nearby indigenous people, half of these had developed into towns. The largest of these outposts was the Black Worm's Nest. The name came from the local indigenous people. Its strangeness stemmed from the abundance of a black sea worm in the surrounding waters. This black worm, known as sea cucumber in human lands, was highly prized as a potent tonic. The Black Worm's Nest's management naturally wouldn't miss such a lucrative opportunity. They organized the harvesting of sea cucumbers and sold them to human lands. Leveraging this unique resource, the Black Worm's Nest amassed substantial trade revenue, powerfully supporting local construction and development, and quickly becoming the first trading post to develop into a town. The Tranquil Plains, Lucky Forest, and Blackwater Basin. This is how the State Council defines the land north of the Western Rocky Mountains, collectively known as the Northern Three Territories. Stanford, former commander of the Northern Exploration Fleet, has been appointed by the State Council as the administrative head of the Northern Three Territories, stationed at Black Worm's Nest to oversee the overall situation. Since the Steppe King's invasion of the Aldor, this region has immediately gained importance due to its proximity to the Great Plains. Black Worm's Nest received instructions from Horde, fully utilize our advantages to bring the still fragmented and weakly united forest orc tribes under our control, even if this cannot be accomplished, prevent the steppe from further controlling them. After the Aldor and Steppe King's invasion reached a peace agreement, Black Worm's Nest received another message from Horde, emphasizing the urgency and necessity of bringing the Northern Three Territories under our control. Stanford felt the pressure. According to the information he possessed, news of the Steppe King's conquest of the Northern Aldor had reached the forests of the three northern lands. Some ambitious individuals, seemingly emboldened by the feats of their steppe kin, were eyeing the nearby human settlements. One of them was Gunther, the son of the chieftain of the Blood Bowl tribe. This fellow had recently been traveling around, attempting to unite with other fools harboring similar ambitions, planning a major attack on humanity at some point. So, our young chieftain has already amassed a considerable force. Stanford sat in his office, white smoke rising from his pipe, calmly inquiring of the guest across his desk. Yes, sir. Shortly before my departure, another tribe formed an alliance with him. The guest was dressed in the fashionable attire of Arda merchants. Were it not for the thick, noticeable body hair indicating he was an orc, he could almost be mistaken for a robust human. To advertise human goods and fulfill the mission assigned to him by Lake Town, Stanford instructed each outpost to showcase the allure of human civilization. Of course, discussing poetry with a bunch of creatures who didn't even have a written language was a bit far-fetched at this stage, so the primary attraction was material goods. Clean and presentable clothing, comfortable and bright housing, delicious and abundant food, and so on. Many things about humans were killer weapons for the forest orcs, who were still in a primitive tribal state. In addition, Stanford focused on cultivating relationships with orcs of considerable standing within each tribe, developing a network of informants to provide him with intelligence. For example, Mr. Brother before him. Chapter 712 Warning. Even in the less developed northern regions, primitive commerce existed, and Briar was a traveling orc merchant who frequented various tribes. He was a male orc nearing 40, and unlike his kin who were often disheveled, his thick hair was meticulously styled, and combined with his neatly dressed alder attire, he possessed a refined air. After the alder people began trading deep into the forests, the quick-witted Briar immediately sensed a golden opportunity to multiply his wealth. Through tireless effort, he became one of the alder's agents, monopolizing trade between several tribes and the alder. Dear Mr. Briar, thank you for the valuable information you provided, Stanford said gratefully to the orc. Believe me, your friendship will be rewarded in kind. Briar's nose twitched, and a shadow fell across his face. Stanford asked curiously, what's wrong, my friend? Is something on your mind? The orc hesitated before replying, Mr. Stanford, I believe in your friendship, but I'm not so sure about you now, or rather, whether you have the ability to defend our friendship. Oh, Stanford raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by that? The orc lowered his head slightly, rubbing his hands together. I've heard about what happened south of the mountains. The royal court on the plains has penetrated deep into your lands, conquering the northern alder. If you're no longer able to hold on, then I, and those like me, will face a difficult choice. Stanford chuckled inwardly. He knew what Briar meant by choice, to continue the peaceful trade, or to cooperate with those malicious kin to seize humanity's wealth. Of course, while facing a choice, it wouldn't be considered difficult, as the law of the jungle was deeply ingrained in these men's minds. Yes, but more specifically, it's the northern alder, except for the Northwest Bay, Stanford added calmly. Briar looked up in surprise, seemingly puzzled that Stanford had admitted it so openly. I think you should know something about us, Aldo. Stanford stood up, walked over, poured 2 glasses of wine, and handed one to Briar. Just as you are divided into tribes, the alder are also divided into feudal lords. He returned to his seat and took a small sip of wine. The differences between these feudal lords are vast. Some are very powerful, some are very weak. The differences between them are even greater than the differences between your largest and smallest tribes. The failure of some territories does not mean that others will fail, especially our Western Bay, especially our Arda. And as far as I know, Stanford smiled, the reason why the Royal Tenth's army did not conquer the entire Northern Alder was because they encountered strong resistance when they approached the Northwestern Bay. The Arda defeated their westward advancing army, annihilating more than 3,000 of them, while suffering only about 300 casualties themselves. A casualty ratio of 10 to 1, you should be able to tell which side is stronger. Oh, it's not that I don't trust you, Briar said with difficulty, but in any case, this war seems to have ended with the Alder recognizing the Royal Tenth's occupation of their lands. If your army has achieved such a brilliant victory, why not press on and drive those steppe people back? Yes, Stanford frowned, a hint of annoyance finally appearing on his face. It's like a strong physique paired with a mentally unstable head. Above the Alder territories, there's a so-called kingdom government, somewhat similar to the steppe tribes being controlled by the Royal Tenth. The lords of each feudal territory have absolute control over their own lands, but matters outside their own territories must be decided by the kingdom government. Stanford paused. At least, the kingdom government's will cannot be ignored. Because of the kingdom government's mentally unstable head, the Northwest Bay Army lacked a legitimate reason to pursue their victory and could only stop at the border. Stanford raised his voice, but believe me, the Northwest Bay Army absolutely has the ability to defend its land. And even the kingdom government has no right to make us give up our ability to defend our land. There was a moment of silence between the two. Finally, the orc nodded heavily. Dear Stanford, I choose to believe you, and I hope our friendship lasts forever. I have a little bit of information here, perhaps you'd be interested in hearing it. Oh? Is it about Gunther? Yes, Stanford perked up his ears. My dear Mr. Briar, please don't keep me in suspense. I'm very interested in everything about him. The conflict between Gunther of the Blood Bowl tribe and the human official Stanford was no secret in this forest. Everyone knew that Gunther had almost died at Stanford's hands and had been carried back alive by sheer luck. Briar smiled slightly. Gunther and his cronies are secretly preparing to attack one of your strongholds. Stanford straightened up immediately, his earlier ease gone. Do you know which stronghold they're targeting? Westwind Keep, Briar whispered. They're plotting an attack on Westwind Keep. Stanford's eyes flickered, seemingly in thought, before he said after a moment, I understand. This information is invaluable. Thank you again, your generosity will save us from significant losses. You're welcome. We're friends, aren't we? To be realistic, your presence here has brought me immense wealth, and I don't want you to suffer, Brother said with a smile. After chatting about trade for a while, Stanford personally saw the orc off. Back in his office, he summoned several key officials from the Black Worm's lair and informed them of the impending attack on Westwind Keep. There wasn't much panic. Similar incidents had occurred several times before. This time, however, the involvement of the largest tribe, the Blood Bowl clan, was a bit tricky. We need to strengthen the defenses there, Stanford emphasized at the meeting. Drawing manpower from other locations is troublesome enough with the Blood Bowl clan, and Gunther has also gathered a large number of allies. We need to make a grand display of our defensive strength, ideally deterring them from even considering small-scale attacks. His orders were quickly carried out. Brother's intelligence was accurate. 2 weeks later, the forest orcs' attack began. But Brother's intelligence was also inaccurate. The orcs' target wasn't Westwind Keep, but the Black Worm's lair. Chapter 713 Victory over the Black Worm's Nest. As soon as the attack began, some orcs sensed something was amiss. The Black Worm's lair was divided into inner and outer sections. The inner city, developed from the initial human settlements, was surrounded by sturdy walls that stretched all the way to the docks. The outer city was inhabited by many local natives who had come to join the attack, and it was usually bustling with people due to trade. But today, it was eerily quiet. Had everyone gone to the inner city? Upon closer inspection, they found the inner city gates tightly shut, and those with keen eyesight spotted heavily guarded soldiers on the walls. Some suggested to Gunther that the attack be cancelled, but Gunther, blinded by deep-seated hatred and immense temptation, rejected the suggestion and insisted on proceeding with the original plan. His orders were carried out. The strong orcs, wielding clubs and carrying ladders for scaling the walls, howled as they ran towards the inner city walls. Along the way, they triggered trap after trap, and the guards on the walls fired at them. The humans, as expected, were prepared. The whooshing of crossbow bolts and the banging of muskets mingled together. The attackers suffered greatly, incurring significant casualties, but fortunately, they managed to prop the ladders up the wall. The walls of Black Worm's Nest, a newly established town, were not high, and even the ladders made with the forest orcs' rudimentary technology were manageable. They charged forward, wielding large wooden shields. Just as their kin on the plains were natural riders, these orcs, raised in the forest, were natural hunters, having honed their skills from childhood by climbing and traversing the dense woods. But the heavily armed human defenders on the wall stopped them. From the forest orcs' perspective, the humans before them were undeniably heavily armed. They wore full suits of metal armor, helmets covering their entire heads, and their swords gleamed so brightly they reflected images. The orcs, on the other hand, mostly carried only wooden clubs and stone spears, their bodies covered merely in animal hides. Faced with the overwhelmingly superior human defenders, the orcs who reached the top of the wall were simply throwing their lives away. Besides the sharp swords, musketeers hidden behind the walls relentlessly picked off targets, firing deadly metal bullets. The battle was fierce. The sounds of fighting pierced the dense forest outside the city, startling flocks of birds into flight. The attackers were valiant, but they made no progress. They stormed the walls, retreated, stormed again, retreated again, a repetitive cycle that only increased casualties. Moreover, the number of humans was not as small as they had anticipated, a fact that particularly shocked the orc attackers, a fact they unfortunately only realized after the battle had reached a stalemate. Gunther, we can't fight anymore. I suggest we retreat immediately. A disheveled orc chieftain, his hair covered in scabs, anxiously approached the young chieftain of the Blood Bowl tribe. Coward, Gunther roared, tearing his gaze from the ravaged fortress walls. Just hold on a little longer, and those humans on the walls will give up and scatter, leaving us to slaughter them. Their wealth accumulated here will be within our grasp. Gunther's eyes were red, spittle flying everywhere, his excited expression making one wonder if he was hallucinating. The orc chieftain, Grosso, frowned deeply, swallowing back a string of profanities that were about to spill from his lips. He simply said, "Your plan didn't work at all. If the Black Worm's Nest only had a few dozen guards as you thought, that would be fine. But now there are nearly 200 people standing on the walls alone. The humans didn't fall for your trick at all. Instead, they used it to set a trap, just waiting for us to foolishly walk into it." "Shut your filthy mouth," Gunther roared in anger. He suddenly sprang up, grabbed Grosso by the front of his clothes, and yanked him violently. The force sent the orc flying, tumbling several times before crashing to the ground in a sorry state. Roar! The eyes of those who came with Grosso instantly turned red, and they brandished their weapons, ready to fight Gunther. Stop! Grosso got up from the ground, laughing mockingly. Then you can continue fighting here, brave Gunther. He then ordered his men, gather our men and get out of this hellhole as soon as possible, you demoralizing bastard. Gunther brandished his greatsword, one of the few metal weapons in the group, and vowed to kill Grosso. Just as a fight was about to break out, the commotion behind them stopped them. To everyone's surprise, a dense mass of figures appeared in the surrounding forest. Ha ha ha. It's all familiar faces. A tall orc carrying a large axe stepped forward. Gramta? What are you doing here? Gunther asked loudly, puzzled. Are you joining our hunt too? Of course. The newcomer licked his lips, his eyes gleaming as he sized Gunther up. And the prey I want is right here, HMPH. Gunther was displeased. I don't object to you joining, but the distribution of the spoils must be my arrangement, because I initiated this hunt. Oh, Gradam's expression was ambiguous. Fool, Grosso roared, realizing something was wrong. He's hunting us. He now deeply regretted cooperating with such a guy. Gradam laughed and swung his long axe, and the orcs behind him swarmed forward. How dare you? Gunther was about to explode. Anger consumed him, but unlike before, fear was also mixed in. But his men were all gathered below the city walls and couldn't come to his aid, while Gradam's men surrounded them completely and fiercely attacked. Gunther brandished his greatsword in fury, howling to dispel his inner fear. But after a fierce battle, he and his two leaders, Grosso and others, were captured alive. Upon learning of the trouble at their rear, the attackers, already exhausted from the stagnant fighting, almost instantly collapsed. At that moment, the city gates opened, and humans rushed out, joining orcs emerging from the forest in a pincer attack. Those who couldn't escape had no choice but to surrender. Lord Stanford, Gradam said gleefully, dragging the bound Gunther before Stanford, this is my gift to you. The once ferocious young chieftain of the Blood Bowl tribe was now barely alive, his eyes swollen shut. Stanford glanced at him and ordered him taken away. Too slow, he said disapprovingly. If you had been any later, I guarantee you wouldn't have gotten a single credit for this. You don't think my men can't handle them alone, do you? Sensing the sternness in Stanford's tone, Gradam knelt respectfully on one knee. I'm sorry, sir. You know we had to lie in ambush further away so they wouldn't find us. Before the battle began, Stanford had ordered the orcs living outside the Black Worm's nest to stay away. But if they wanted to return quickly, they had to prove their loyalty through their actions. Gradam was the most prestigious among these orcs. Stanford didn't believe his reasons. Perhaps this guy was just observing and then joining the victorious side. There's one more small gift, seemingly to appease Stanford's displeasure. Gradam waved his hand, and another bound man was brought over. Ah, my dear friend, Stanford said with some regret, looking at the bound man. Why are you with Gunther? The prisoner, Brouwer, looked embarrassed and bitter. How did you know Gunther's real target? Dear Brouwer, you don't think you're the only one in this forest willing to be my friend, do you? Me too. Gradam grinned and leaned closer. Brouwer looked dejected and fell silent. Stanford ignored him and turned his gaze into the depths of the forest. What should he do next? According to Lacquer Town, some things needed to be done sooner. As the most powerful native force here, the Blood Bowl tribe had to be taken down, and Gunther's reckless attack undoubtedly provided a good excuse. Although Stanford had a good relationship with the tribal chief, Asware, personal feelings had to wait. Chapter 714 Alvis. The candlelight cast a tall, slightly hunched shadow on the white wall. The white-haired old man's hands trembled as he gripped a quill pen tightly, writing rapidly on a piece of paper. Your Highness, please forgive my abrupt departure. He frowned and pondered for a moment before finally deciding to get straight to the point. You actually betrayed the Alder, a nation like ours whose inhabitants are also human, for the sake of making peace with the orcs. Before this, I couldn't imagine you could do something so unwise. I apologize for using such strong language, but with my limited wisdom, I simply cannot fathom the profound strategies behind this. Wasn't the Alder you were satisfied with before? We instigated Giles' rebellion, already plunging the nation into a predicament where it was preoccupied with its own survival. In its weakened state, it had already achieved our initial goal, making it unable to attend to events elsewhere on the continent. In that situation, what's the point of introducing such a barbaric race as the orcs, subjecting the Alder people to further suffering, Now those barbaric fellows have entered the fertile northern Alder, where countless people and resources reside. They will eventually cause the already destructive steppe kingdom to swell into an uncontrollable force. Perhaps, the old man's hands trembled more deeply, his brow furrowed with uncontrollable worry, yet he persisted in writing. Like most people, I once held this race of the plains in contempt. I contempt their culture, believing that with their tradition of plundering and nomadic lifestyles, even the strongest military force would be a mere hindrance, but since receiving the latest news about the orcs from Marshal MacDonald, I have devoted myself to studying this race, which has long been overlooked by mainstream human scholars. Finally, I discovered that the Marshal's earlier warnings were not exaggerated at all. The orcs have begun to learn human social structures, gradually transitioning from a fragmented group to an authoritarian state. However, until recently, they were not a real threat. The fragile ecosystem of the plains could not provide them with a sustainable source of power for conquest. Therefore, the most crucial thing was to prevent the orcs from acquiring a key agricultural region that could continuously provide various resources, but now they have one, because of your strategy. Although the north of Alder is not wealthy, it still has the potential to provide a stronghold for a powerful force. Rodney's ancestors conquered the western part of the continent from the north. The old man wrote wearily, "Your Highness, I regret that I can no longer serve you. If left unchecked, humanity might be ravaged by the orcs before even facing the prophesied great destroyer. I realize I must do something. It's a desperate decision, as my individual strength is insignificant and can make no difference, but I must do it. Here, I wish you success in your endeavors, and hope our shared ideal will ultimately be realized, all humanity united under one banner against our enemies, whether the orcs in reality or the prophesied destroyer." Alvis picked up the letter and gently blew on the ink to dry it. He sighed, carefully folded the letter, tucked it into the envelope, and placed it neatly on his desk. Just then, there was a soft knock on the door. He turned around alertly. "Master Alvis. The carriage is ready." It was his servant and guard, Malik. Alvis breathed a sigh of relief. "Let's go immediately." He strode outside without hesitation. It was 3 days later when the people of the Scholar's Tower discovered the departure of this renowned scholar. After all, it was common for high-ranking scholars like him to lock themselves in their rooms for days and nights in deep thought, so no one dared to enter Alvis's room without permission. Finally, when Aldrich came to see him, he found the room empty, with only 2 letters on the desk, one to him, his senior, and the other to His Highness Antonio. Aldrich rushed to the palace. "Why would Alvis do this?" Antonio asked, after a brief moment of shock, utterly bewildered. It was too abrupt. "It's all written in the letter," Aldrich thought to himself. He glanced at Antonio with some concern. For a long time, the prince's subordinates had been loyal to him, and he had grown accustomed to their loyalty, so much so that he couldn't accept the simple explanations in the letter after this incident. Since learning of the prince's deal with the orcs in the north, Alvis had vehemently opposed it, but to no avail. Antonio still kept his deal with the orcs, instructing the Arcane Society to cooperate with the orcs' invasion of the Alder. If the orcs were trapped with the Alder, even if their attention was diverted for a short time, it would be beneficial for him to integrate Gabella. Ahem. "Perhaps it's his other half of the Alder blood that's causing the problem," Aldrich explained, making it emotionally impossible for him to accept your arrangements. "Bloodline." Antonio was taken aback, his eyes dimming. "I understand. Perhaps this made sense. Didn't his own half of the bloodline naturally place him on the side of the wizards?" "Your Highness, Enag Christopher, a member of the Arcane Society's 10-member group, was also there." He reminded him in a shrill voice, "Master Alvis knows too many secrets. Perhaps you should." He made a gesture that everyone understood. "You?" Aldrich's eyes widened as he defended his junior. "I swear on my honor, Alvis would never reveal any secrets detrimental to us." "Oh. Master Aldrich," Enag said sarcastically, "I respect your character and knowledge, but you are not a god. I don't want to lose both our secrets and your integrity one day." Antonio frowned, pondering under their gazes. "Teacher," when the prince looked at Aldrich with a sorrowful expression, Aldrich lowered his head sadly, and the foremost scholar of the Maester's Tower calmed down. "I beg you to let him depart with dignity." Antonio nodded slowly, turning his gaze to the other person in the room. "Sigrid, you will see Alvis off. Do as your teacher says." Me, the witch, who had been silent all along, frowned in displeasure. "Alvis has been gone for 3 days." Her beautiful face always seemed to be covered with a layer of frost. and her frown made the temperature in the room drop even lower. Antonio, unusually pleading, said, "That's why I'm asking you. In this matter, no one is more trustworthy than you." The witch's lips seemed to curl slightly, and the room's temperature seemed to rise considerably. "In that case, all right. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 715 Precious Bird Droppings. Education can sharpen one's mind and make one more receptive to new things. Therefore, I suggest, the newly appointed Marcus Paul Gleman of the Kingdom of Waldo was writing at his desk, a thick stack of papers already piled to the right. He was carefully considering what he could and could not say, his hands transferring what he could say onto the paper. Sometimes he would struggle with how to express himself, occasionally crossing out a sentence he had already written, or simply crumpling the entire sheet into a ball. Although this was written for the king, Paul subconsciously viewed this behavior as a form of writing, likely to be published someday, and the Marcus didn't want people to see even a single sentence of elementary grammar in his book. Just as he was stuck on a certain passage for a long time, rubbing his temples and deciding to end his morning work, a servant came to report. "Captain Glenn requests a meeting with you. He has good news. He has brought back the members of the previously captured exploration team." "Glenn." Paul jumped up from his chair. "They've come to Crystal Radiance." "Yes, the fleet is still resting in Franklin Harbor, while Mr. Glenn sailed south in his flagship to find you. Quickly, invite them to the reception room." A year ago, the Western Exploration Fleet completed the first circumnavigation of the globe in the history of this planet's civilization. They discovered another unknown continent inhabited by various strange races. Some had bull heads, some had cat heads. Compared to the orcs of the old world, they seemed to be the true orcs. But there was also a race whose faces were identical to humans, except for long horns like sheep on their heads. They called themselves the Surdan, and their civilization far surpassed that of the other races on that continent. Unfortunately, the exploration team was attacked by the Surdan, and 5 members were captured. After Glenn led the fleet back to the Northwest Bay for a brief rest, with Paul's support, he immediately replenished the ships and manpower, setting sail for the other side of the ocean, vowing to rescue the captured team members. They were finally back. Paul hurried to the reception room. There were only a few people there, Glenn himself, a few deputies, and the 5 men captured by the Surdans. "Thank God you're all alright," he recognized Vito among them. After a warm greeting and pleasantries, Glenn, as the leader of the exploration team, recounted the voyage to Paul. "We've reached that land again, and as I told you before, a strait divides them into northern and southern parts. The fleet went straight to the Surdan port along the same route as last time. The official in charge of the port was very friendly and even apologized for what happened last time. To be honest, I thought they would immediately turn on us. They said their queen had ordered that we be treated with courtesy if we reappeared and invited us to visit the capital. Out of caution, we didn't immediately accept, until they brought Vito and the others over. Our team members are in good condition, looking healthy and well, and haven't been mistreated. But according to them, some certain nobles did initially treat them as slaves, and these were the same people who planned the last attack. But after they were given to the Surdan queen, she restored their freedom." Paul nodded, his brow relaxing. "She seems like a nice person." At this moment, the members of the exploration team exchanged glances. Paul noticed something strange. "What's wrong?" "Is something you can't say." "Ahem." Glenn cleared his throat and continued, "After some consideration, I decided to go to the capital of the Surdans to pay homage to the queen." And then, his eyebrows shot up, and surprise flashed in his eyes. "I met her, and you would never guess, that queen looks exactly like someone close to you." "Who?" Paul became interested. Since it was the queen, she must resemble a certain woman. "Lady Laddie Gerard Saoirse," Glenn exclaimed. Paul frowned. "Laddie? Oh, that's quite a strange thing." "Ha." He then asked, "How similar can they be?" Glenn solemnly replied, "Just as I said, exactly the same." Vito, standing beside him, added, "Face shape, eyes, hair color, as long as you can notice the details, you can't tell them apart." "Oh, except for the horns on the queen's head." Paul couldn't help but laugh. "You haven't had much contact with Laddie, so perhaps you should take a closer look at the details." He looked at the attendant guarding the door. "Please invite Ms. Saoirse here." The green-haired female advisor quickly entered the reception room, and paused for a moment upon seeing the room full of people. Good news, the Western Exploration Fleet has returned. This is Captain Glenn, whom you know, and this is Ms. Lady Saoirse. Paul introduced them to each other. Apart from Glenn, Vito, and a few others, not every guest had seen Laddie before. In unison, almost everyone immediately turned their gaze to Laddie. Exactly the same, really, exactly the same. I thought I was seeing Her Majesty the Queen again. Faced with such an intense barrage of gazes and gasps of amazement, the female advisor blushed slightly, a rare occurrence. Confused about what was happening, she looked somewhat awkwardly at Paul. Paul asked, "Now that you've looked closely, do you still think they look the same?" Everyone nodded in unison. "Well, this is an interesting thing," Paul explained to Laddie. "They say that a queen on another continent, actually, a certain, that horned race, looks exactly like you. Is that so?" Laddie breathed a sigh of relief. She had thought her wizard identity had been exposed. At Paul's gesture, the female advisor gracefully sat down. "There are many people in the world who look alike. There's nothing surprising about it, but," Vito couldn't help but say, "you and she are practically twins, no, clones." Laddie smiled politely and remained silent. Paul, knowing the female advisor didn't want to attract too much attention due to her other identity, changed the subject. "Let's talk about something else. Queen Certain has shown us goodwill, allowing us to purchase a property in the port as a guest house, and promising to protect our merchants according to her laws if we go on to trade." "That's good," Paul approvingly stated. "Transoceanic trade requires larger merchant ships. The shipping industry in the Northwest Bay should be strengthened. And we left a small squadron to conduct surveys along the coast. When they return, they'll have detailed nautical charts and hydrographic data. Also, we brought back that mineral deposit you mentioned, a deposit formed from guano." Paul exclaimed, Yes, that's it. How much did you collect?" Glenn held out his right hand. 5 shiploads." Marcus Gleman stood up, pacing happily on the floor. "We must immediately send a message to the State Council, instructing them to organize experiments. If this mineral deposit truly is a rare and valuable natural fertilizer, its impact on agriculture will be enormous." Chapter 716 Language Reform. Paul's time in Crystal Glory was quite good. Rodney's VIE had gifted him a manor, where he spent his days writing and receiving guests. As a newly appointed Marquis, he also frequently attended the king's cabinet meetings. He knew his new title had aroused envy in many, so he mostly remained a silent listener at meetings, only expressing his thoughts to the king privately afterward. In the early days, many in the capital's aristocratic circles wanted to befriend him, and invitations to various banquets poured in. However, he wasn't good at such occasions. He didn't understand many of the jokes in Crystal Glory's circles, and when those around him started laughing, he could only laugh along inexplicably. Later, he realized how foolish he was, and whenever a banquet began, he would take a glass of wine and slowly sip it in a corner. He simply couldn't muster the motivation to participate in those boring topics. Over time, he earned the title of King of Awkward Silence, and the Crystal Glory aristocratic circles reached a consensus. Inviting Marquis Paul Gleman to a banquet was a terrible idea. The Marquis always tried hard to keep a low profile, but because of his status, people couldn't really ignore him. The number of invitations gradually decreased, which was exactly what Paul had hoped for. However, unless someone harbored hostility, no one labeled him rude, mean, or cold. In personal relationships, the Marquis was generally sincere. If someone asked for his help, he would never refuse if it was within his ability. Especially in business, as the initial initiator of large-scale maritime trade in recent years and the owner of the kingdom's most industrially and commercially developed region, Paul possessed much important information that others couldn't access. When someone consulted him, the Marquis was always generous in sharing. He knew which goods were in high demand and which places, where important raw materials were produced, and which companies' bonds held the most value. Despite the Marquis's relatively low social activity, many people in Crystal Radiance still liked him. While many liked him, many also disliked him. In the eyes of the old-school nobles, although Paul Gleman's lineage could be traced back to the founding of the kingdom, he could hardly be considered a typical older nobleman. This was partly because he came from a place teeming with nouveau riche, the Crystal nobles' new impression of the Northwest Bay, and partly because of his many unconventional actions, especially the plethora of ideas he presented to His Majesty the King. Indeed, increasing the treasury's revenue was correct, and some of his ideas were quite brilliant. But what about prioritizing education for the common people? It sounded like it wouldn't increase the treasury's revenue at all, but would instead cost a fortune each year. Your Majesty, this will not benefit the kingdom's finances in the short term. If you need a large number of talented people, can't you use so many well-educated noble sons? When Rodney's VIE discussed this within his small circle of reform advisors, some were quite disapproving. The king's advisory group was small, including Paul and Mellon. I've discussed this with Marcus Gleman, Rodney's VIE said, glancing at Paul present. He then explained to Earl Walsh McKee, who had objected, I suppose those from noble families wouldn't stoop to work in factories, ports, and farms. I think so, but those places will inevitably need a large number of skilled professionals in the future, especially in operating machinery. They will need to be literate to quickly learn various skills, Earl McKee said dismissively, but commoner children are too innate, dull and clumsy. Teaching them would require too much effort and resources. That's a wrong view, Rodney's VIE disagreed, saying, Princess Irene's own school enrolls many commoner children. I've confirmed with her that there isn't a significant difference in learning ability between excellent commoner and noble students. Earl McKee shook his head. I think individual cases don't prove anything, the king said displeasedly. I think conclusions drawn from practice are far more reliable than stereotypes passed down through word of mouth. Very well, Your Majesty, Earl McKee spread his hands. I only hope that the investment in education for the common people is within a controllable range. It would be terrible if it turned out to be a bottomless pit, Rodney's VIE smiled. We don't need them to learn poetry and music, just reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Besides, Marcus Gleman has an idea to achieve this. What was it called again? He looked at Paul again. Reducing costs and increasing efficiency, Your Majesty, Paul replied. How so? Everyone present turned to look at him. Paul thought for a moment, then said seriously, as Your Majesty just said, we don't need commoners to learn poetry, music, art, and so on. What we need to teach them is a large amount of applied knowledge, something concise and efficient. Therefore, the content in the textbooks should be easy to read quickly, understand at a glance, and memorize after a few readings. Thus, the grammar prevalent in upper-class aristocratic society is unsuitable. He raised his voice. I suggest a simplification and reform of the older language textbooks. Simplification and reform? Everyone was puzzled. Yes, simplify. First, change those convoluted and lengthy traditional grammar rules into a simple, straightforward style like spoken language. Second, appropriately abbreviate overly complex words, ideally keeping them under 10 letters to make them easy to spell and remember at a glance. These two measures will not only make it easier for students to learn, but also make it easier to typeset the textbooks, saving a lot of paper and ink. Although it might not save much per book, the cost savings when printing on a large scale will be enormous. Another key point is that such simple textbooks do not require a high level of education from teachers, which will help us quickly establish an education system. Paul finished speaking, but the room fell silent. Nonsense, Earl Walsh McKee broke the silence with a livid face. Yes, this is utter nonsense. This is trampling on our beautiful older language, an insult to the precious legacy left to us by our ancestors. Many people shouted, and various harsh criticisms rang out. When the advisory group was first established, Rodney's 18 rules required everyone to speak freely. After a period of testing, everyone realized that the king seemed to be serious, provided that only members of the advisory group were present, and from then on, people were less restrained in speaking at these internal meetings. I'm just suggesting an idea. Whether to implement it and how to implement it is entirely up to your wise judgment. Paul said with a smile, spreading his hands without offering any rebuttal. Chapter 717 Returning Home. For Paul, who grew up in the Northwest Bay, the glittering winters were rather dull. Whether in his past life or this one, he loved the swirling, heavy snowfalls, ideally piling up to his calves. Whenever such weather struck, Paul liked to build a roaring fire indoors, roast meat, or cook what others considered his invention, a hot pot, enjoying the warmth of the fire and the delicious food while admiring the snowy landscape outside. If a howling wind added to the ambience, it was even better. The outside world was harsh, but the people inside were content. However, in the past, only a handful of people in Arda could enjoy this kind of comfort. In the early years, living conditions in the entire Northwest Bay were poor. In the eyes of the southern nobles, it was a barbaric place. For the common people, The heavy snowfalls Paul loved were nothing short of a natural disaster, as many of the elderly, weak, and disabled would succumb to the cold. For a transmigrator from modern society with even a modicum of human compassion, this caused a pang of conscience. After all, he was the local lord. Fortunately, the economy improved later, and people no longer starved or froze to death in the winters, allowing Paul to indulge in his little hobbies with peace of mind. However, compared to the Northwest Bay, Jingaeo's winters were rather short, with only a few heavy snowfalls, and not the kind of wild, all-encompassing snow that seemed to blot out the world. Paul somewhat missed his days in the Northwest Bay. He put down his deck of cards, gazing absently at the falling snowflakes outside the window. Perhaps I should go back. Rodney's Vilai, who was pondering his next move, looked up. What's wrong? Are you uncomfortable living in Crystal Glory? No, Your Majesty, the environment here is extremely comfortable, life is peaceful, truly the best place in Alder. Paul smiled. If it weren't for my responsibilities, I'd love to live here forever. Hypocritical platitudes, Rodney's Vilai scoffed. The environment I'm referring to isn't just the living conditions, but also public opinion, he sighed, standing up with a melancholy expression. Recently, there have been some unfriendly conclusions about you in Crystal Glory. The king's words were true. Even if Paul was a homebody, he could sense the turmoil outside, even a storm. Previously, the Crystal Glory noble's impression of Paul was mostly positive, but recently it had plummeted. The turning point was Paul's suggestion of language reform. It was as if something had suddenly been released from its cage, running rampant throughout the world, planting a bad impression of the newly appointed Marcus in many people's minds. Marcus Gleman is trying to pollute our elegant Alder language with those crude and vulgar country slang. What a barbarian from the countryside. He can't be elegant himself, so he tries to drag everyone down to the same level. This is definitely a conspiracy to destroy the Alder from the root. He's as barbaric as those rude, illiterate orcs. It's terrifying. Could it be? Such rumors spread wider and wider within Crystal Radiance, becoming increasingly outrageous. The content even escalated to the point that Gleman was secretly cooperating with the orcs, and his military victory in the Northwest was merely a scheme orchestrated by the orcs to elevate him to the kingdom's upper echelons, giving him enough influence to undermine the roots of Alder culture. Upon hearing these rumors, Rodney's Vilai flew into rage and sent his guards to imprison all those spreading such rumors. Thanks to the king's own endorsement, the absurdity of the various rumors about Marcus Gleman was finally somewhat mitigated, but doubts about him continued unabated. I know, someone must be manipulating all this behind the scenes, Rodney's Vilai said bitterly, revealing his suspicion. Your immense military achievements, dazzling title, and especially your youth, have probably made many people jealous. There are many controversies surrounding you, but since the writing reform, the opposition has suddenly grown louder, like jumping off a cliff. There's no reason for that. Paul remained non-committal, but he shared the same suspicion as the king. Perhaps it would be better for me to return to the Northwest Bay. He looked sincerely at the king. Your Majesty, I have basically finished compiling what you asked me to do. I hope it will provide some ideas for your upcoming reforms. Let me make it clear first, Arda and the Northwest Bay are, after all, just a corner of the kingdom. The successful experiences there cannot be fully applied elsewhere, Rodney's Vilai said somewhat dejectedly. Are you finally leaving me? Well, thank you for your hard work. I will keep your advice in mind. The king decided to respect Paul's personal wishes. Returning to the Northwest Bay to avoid a storm was a good idea. Besides, Gleman would eventually have to return to reorganize the military and prepare for the future counterattack against the orcs. The sooner he prepares, the sooner he can launch his counterattack. In a small oasis town in the desert, Alvis, supported by his guard Marek, stumbled through the alleyways in a sorry state. Unbelievable, truly unbelievable, Marek said bitterly. They could be so ruthless. Alvis gave a bitter smile. What's unbelievable about it? If I were in that position, I would never let someone who knows most of my secrets leave my control, but he's practically grown up under your watchful eye. And Lord Aldrich, with your decades-long friendship, didn't you try to dissuade him? Marek's tone was filled with anger. Just moments ago, the master and servant, who had traveled north to this small town, were attacked. As Alvis's trusted guard, despite Marek's superb martial arts skills, he was no match for the attacker, Sigrid, known as the Ice Witch. The fact that His Highness the Prince sent such a highly capable confidant shows that he was determined to kill Alvis. During the battle, an ice spike nearly killed the scholar. Fortunately, Malik had prepared many things for this escape, so he immediately swallowed the forbidden drug previously distributed by the Arcane Society. With his strength surging, he desperately threw his longsword, finally forcing the witch to temporarily dodge. He then threw out several smoke bombs, and under the cover of the thick smoke, he carried Alvis on his back and ran wildly to escape the pursuit. "It's no use saying all this," Alvis said weakly. "If she comes after us again, we'll be helpless." He pulled out a bag. "Sigh, Malek, take this money and go by yourself. I'm too old to be a burden to you." "Don't say such discouraging things," Malek frowned. "That witch knows our whereabouts. The original route from Watcher's Fortress into North Alder is no longer feasible. How about, we'll infiltrate a caravan and go around the Great Plains?" Alvis was surprised. "Go around?" Malek nodded. "I got some information from the merchants. It seems there are trading posts run by the Alder people in the west of the Great Plains." Chapter 718 Southward Ambition. While the north of Alder was blanketed in snow and ice, its south remained lush and verdant. This was especially true of Five Rams Castle, which enjoyed a warm and pleasant climate, showing no signs of winter. The abundant Pearl River flowed westward from the inland, passing south of Five Rams Castle before emptying into the sea, creating an alluvial plain of exceptionally fertile soil, the finest in the south. These uniquely favorable conditions made it the natural center of Alder's southern rule and the Giles family's greatest asset in dominating the south. In the luxurious castle on the eastern side of the city, a grand birthday banquet had been underway for 2 days, and the night was still raging. Giles, the Lord of the South, the Grand Duke known as the Greedy Wolf, celebrated his 46th birthday in the spring like winter. Countless vassals were summoned to Five Rams Castle, reveling in a sea of fine wine and delicacies. Grand Duke Giles, seated high on the throne, was slightly drowsy, his cheeks flushed from heavy drinking, yet his posture remained ramrod straight, a long-standing habit that maintained his dignified bearing at all times. He exhaled heavily, rising steadily to his feet, and slowly walked out of the hall through the conversing crowd. Stepping out of the high doorway, a spacious terrace, about 100 feet square, unfolded before him. The Grand Duke puffed out his chest, strolling confidently across the terrace, his magnificent silk robes billowing in the wind, their ornaments jingling softly. The castle stood atop the highest point in the city, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding land for kilometers around. The densely packed buildings stretched into the distance with his gaze. "My kingdom. This is my kingdom." He looked down at the city below, overflowing with pride, even his neatly trimmed beard trembling slightly. The Grand Duke's sharp gaze pierced the city walls, the chessboard-like fields outside, and the dense jungle, finally reaching the distant north. The distance, shrouded in night, seemed to hold immense allure, causing Giles to linger and gaze. "Your Highness, what brings you here?" Hearing the voice behind him, Giles turned to see his two most trusted men approaching. "Samar, Wendell, you've come too? I came out for some fresh air." "Alice, I'm getting old, even a little wine has made me a bit tipsy." "A little wine," Samar chuckled. "The empty wine jars beside your table could build a wall, HMPH, if I were a few years younger." "Wendell, what are you holding?" Sir Wendell stepped forward, handing over an envelope. "This is why we've come to see you. Just now, someone from the church gave this to me, requesting that it be given to you." "Oh?" Giles took the envelope with a puzzled look, gently tearing it open and quickly glancing at the letter inside. HMPH, 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 he let out a deep chuckle. "I never thought the mighty papacy would need my help." Wendell and Samar exchanged a glance, then asked in confusion, "The papacy?" "That's right, the papacy." Giles put away the letter. "They're requesting that I send troops to assist them in attacking the north of Horn Bay." Both vassals were quite surprised. Alder's southern border bordered the north of Horn Bay, making an attack from there very convenient. And as everyone knew, the papacy's army had suffered a major defeat in the north of Horn Bay. Samar looked cautious. "So what do you mean?" "It's something to consider." Giles smiled slightly. "They've offered quite a lot." He then handed the letter to the two men, the contents of which made Wendell and Samar's eyes light up. "But what about Crystal Radiance?" Wendell voiced his concern. After all, they were still nominally lords of Alder. HMPH. "Why bother with those good-for-nothings?" Giles said disdainfully. "The previous war made me think the royal family still had some strength left. but I never expected them to hand over the north of the kingdom to the orcs in the blink of an eye. What a joke. Do you know what I was thinking just now? I was thinking, could it be that the war with us exhausted the royal family's last strength, which is why they are so weak in the face of the orcs? If only we had persisted in fighting until the royal family collapsed, we could have marched north, and maybe today's banquet would have been held in the Crystal Palace. His face was full of mockery. Our new king is also a good-for-nothing. To protect his power, he sent Catherine away. Haha, just what I wanted. I swear to the Lord of Light that I will definitely control the Plenty Plains before I turn 50 and be crowned king. At that time, you will all be founding heroes. Giles was drunk and made a bold promise to his subjects. Oh, by the way, any news from Crystal lately? He looked at Wendell. Wendell mentally reviewed the situation. There's something else. Gleman has been banished back to the Northwest Bay. Gleman? Our little Marcus. A strange, intriguing expression flashed across Giles's face. Although he was a Grand Duke, his status was comparable to a prince, only slightly inferior to the king. Although he was practically independent and completely disregarded any orders from Crystal Radiance. Although his ambition was to wear the crown, the thought of the Marquisate, a title that had long since vanished and even carried a certain legendary aura, still stirred something within him. Nonsense. Such an important title is so easily bestowed upon someone, and a mere child at that. Giles looked at Rodney Zvay, who sat on Crystal Radiance's throne, with even greater disdain. Why? He asked. It's said that his various reform proposals have been met with resistance from many people. Reforms? HMPH, Dagong smugly replied, those useless bunch of Jingayo, the more they reform, the more chaotic things get. Of course, the more chaotic things get, the better for us. Giles then asked, before our little Marcus left, didn't you have anyone contact him again? Even though they were in the south and the north, Giles knew a little about him. This guy named Paul Gleman was quite good at managing the economy. His territory was filled with a large amount of goods from the Northwest Bay, which were of excellent quality and low price. That kid must have made a lot of money. Wendell nodded. We've contacted him a few times, but his attitude has always been lukewarm. The Grand Duke snorted heavily. Since that's the case, let's not try to win him over. I just hope he'll be sensible and not become my enemy. At this moment, Samar interjected, regarding Horn Bay, it seems there are wizards involved with this sacrifice alliance. If we agree to the papacy's request, will it affect our relationship with them? Giles frowned. Our relationship with the Arcane Society is nothing more than mutual exploitation. Besides, in the final stages of our war with the royal family, their support drastically decreased, resulting in a stalemate. I've been thinking about how to repay that friendship. He turned his gaze south. If we can get on the papacy's good side, what use will the Arcane Society be? I've made up my mind. Chapter 719 The Church's Request. Lister, appointed by Paul as Arden's representative in Cape Bay, was recently in a state of unease. The war between the Protestant army and the papacy was raging, but the scales of victory were slowly tipping in favor of the papacy. After all, the papacy was backed by the papacy, a behemoth whose power accumulated over centuries was incomparable to the mere coastal states of Cape Bay. In terms of influence alone, the papacy could theoretically mobilize almost half the continent's power to crush this small group of people in Cape Bay who dared to disrespect God. Fortunately for the Protestant army, due to limitations in transportation and execution, the papacy could not exert its full theoretical power, and the Protestant army would not face such a catastrophic disaster. However, even though the papacy could only wield a single finger in Cape Bay, once it took things seriously, it quickly changed the course of the war. After the failure of the Northern Army's large-scale flanking maneuver, the papacy changed its strategy, shifting to defensive posture in the north and concentrating most of its forces in the south. The papacy even sent its own troops from afar to fight directly. Faced with a greatly strengthened enemy, the Protestant army, advancing eastward, suffered a narrow defeat at the Battle of Melbourne in Collins. Instead of launching another significant offensive, they were pushed back by the papacy-led Exarchus army all the way to the territory of the Horn Bay Alliance. After several more disheartening defeats, the rampaging Exarchus army was now not far from the Alliance's capital, Newsburg. This was the reason for Lister's unease. Ardsley's territory in Horn Bay, Lionport, was not far from Newsburg, only a half-day's ride away. If war were to break out near Newsburg, Lionport would not be able to remain unscathed. On the other hand, Although Arda had maintained a neutral stance in the Horn Bay War until now, doing business with whoever paid them, the prospect of the Exarchus army's inevitable annihilation was, from a personal perspective, unacceptable to Lister. Since Lord Gleman dispatched a fleet to open the Horn Bay route, due to geographical reasons, Alda first established relatively close ties with the coastal countries. The two sides achieved a mutually beneficial relationship through a large-scale trade. In Lion Harbor, the vast majority of Ordos were emotionally inclined towards the church's patronage, primarily composed of coastal nations. Moreover, what was the attitude of the Horn Bay Church and the papacy behind it towards Lion Harbor? The newly recruited mercenaries are almost finished training, and then more than 3,000 soldiers will guard our city. A fleet will soon bring us gunpowder weapons. We will install cannons and deploy muskets on the city walls, which will greatly enhance our defensive capabilities. Merchants have donated funds, so funding is not a problem. In the Lion Harbor City Hall conference room, Lister convened a meeting of the administrators to discuss the recent situation. Irwin, Doug, Ferguson, Raja, and others were among those present. Based on your understanding, what is the likelihood that the church's patronage will attack a neutral party like us? Lister looked at Doug, Ferguson, and other Horn Bay locals. Doug shook his head first. Neutral? There are no true neutrals in war, Ferguson nodded and said. Our little place is too far from the homeland of Alda. The church will plunder us without any scruples, Raja added. It's not just the church, Lord Lister. I must remind you, the Horn Bay Alliance next door is also in danger. They are struggling to protect themselves, and it's hard to guarantee they will still care about our relationship. And the various supplies in Lion City are exactly what they desperately need. A pessimistic atmosphere prevailed. As the military commander, Irwin had to force a smile and boost morale. HMPH, those who dare to rob us will suffer the consequences, Lister pondered for a moment. We should contact the guardians of the church in advance. We must let them know that protecting Aldo merchants is definitely more worthwhile than harming them. Alright, that's all for today's meeting. Please keep the defense in mind. After the meeting, Lister returned to his study with a frown, slumped wearily into a chair, and closed his eyes in deep thought. Not long after, he heard the door open again, followed by soft footsteps and the sound of something hard hitting the table. Lister opened his eyes to find Severe placing a steaming cup of tea on the desk in front of him. Thank you, my dear, he said, a slight smile finally appearing on his bitter face. The two had recently become a couple, and despite the oppressive situation, Lister could at least find solace and relief in the presence of this brown-haired witch. Sylvia gracefully moved behind him, gently massaging Lister's temples. Are you worried about the recent battles? Sigh, it's a long story, Sylvia said indignantly. It's all the fault of those useless bastards in the Protestant army. You can't say that, the Holy See is just too powerful. It's not that I'm afraid of them, but I'm afraid of betraying Lord Gleman's trust in me. Lister suddenly grasped Sylvia's hand. I'm planning to go to the church myself to communicate with him. Sylvia frowned immediately. Too dangerous. The situation is so chaotic, I absolutely won't allow you to go to those beasts. As the two argued, there was a knock at the door. Lord Lister, a gentleman claiming to be a messenger of the church requests a meeting with you. The church? Humph. Sylvia's face was anything but pleasant. Lister, however, was delighted. They actually came to us themselves. Then, a look of worry crossed his face. They won't make any difficult demands, will they? A few minutes later, he met a person sent by the church in the reception room. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the other party made a request that put him in a very difficult position. We request that Lion Harbor cooperate with the church's army in attacking Nisburg. This, Lister's face stiffened. We're here in Horn Bay to do business, we're strictly neutral. The church's envoy smiled slightly. You should think this through, Lord Lister. The blasphemous alliance is doomed to defeat. Lister hesitated. Eton in the north was gaining momentum. He had intended to retort, but he still said, I don't deny your statement, but what does it have to do with us? This land beneath your feet was leased to you by the Horn Bay Alliance. After the church takes full control of Horn Bay, do you think it's necessary for us to maintain an agreement signed with you by our former enemy? Lister realized the seriousness of the problem. Although I am Lord Gleman's representative here, I really don't have the authority to make a decision immediately. I need to consult the Northwest Bay. He planned to use delaying tactics. There's no need for such trouble. You can make your decision directly. The power of the Holy See is immense, and I don't think Lord Gleman, who is far away, would disobey, the envoy used a threatening tone. Chapter 720 The fleet heads south. Upon returning to the Northwest Bay, Paul received shocking news. The small port he rented in Horn Bay was being targeted. Discussions with the council members were pessimistic. They're pressuring Lister to respond within a limited time frame, not even enough for a mail ship to make a round trip. They might already be at our doorstep, or Lister has already surrendered. The latest news is from a merchant ship yesterday. The church's army has been stationed outside Lion City. Their stated reason is part of a unified plan to attack Nisburg, but it's clearly a show of force. We don't even know if the firearms we sent will be enough. Listening to the discussions, Paul suppressed his growing anxiety. He could only confirm two things: under no circumstances can Lionport be handed over to the church, and we cannot send troops to assist them in attacking Nisburg. Lionport was the vital link for merchant ships in the Northwest Bay to sail directly east. Losing it meant the transport of goods in the Northwest Bay would be entirely dependent on others. Sending troops to assist the church was even more impossible. On the one hand, it would be legally inappropriate for him to bypass Crystal Radiance and participate in a war on another country's territory. On the other hand, he wasn't loyal to the papacy, so how could he be led by the nose? Finally, Paul decided to exercise his right of self-defense. This world didn't operate on the principle of a subject must die when the king commands. Even if the king of Aldo wanted to deprive a lord of his life and property without a legitimate reason, the lord would have the right to defend himself. Of course, being unable to defeat him was also considered a legitimate reason, and the Corner Bay Church clearly included this as one of its legitimate reasons. We must send someone to check. If Lion Harbor hasn't fallen, strengthen its defenses. If it has, take it back, Paul angrily instructed the others. With the rise of maritime trade and shipbuilding, the sailing ship construction technology in the Northwest Bay had made significant progress, a notable characteristic being the increasing tonnage of ships. However, the Alden Navy had long been dominant, without any large maritime power as a competitor. Their primary function was to eliminate various pirates and maintain maritime order. Therefore, unlike on Earth where new technologies are prioritized for military applications, the Arden Navy's progress in ship tonnage has consistently lagged behind that of civilian merchant ships. However, through long-term accumulation of experience, and considering factors such as tonnage and function, the Arden Navy began to clearly classify various warships. Generally, those over 1,000 tons were called battleships, those between 500 and 1,000 tons were called cruisers, and those even smaller were collectively referred to as auxiliary ships. Soon, a fleet consisting of one battleship, 15 cruisers, and 30 auxiliary ships was organized, commanded by Admiral Quake, and marched aggressively southward. This battleship, named Sea Fortress, was the first and currently only battleship built by the Arden Navy. Converted from a large merchant ship, it had a strong experimental nature. With 3 decks and equipped with 90 cannons of various types, when anchored in port, its towering hull and densely packed gun ports could make anyone seeing it for the first time think that the Navy had moved a castle to the sea. 3 Marine battalions also sailed south with the fleet, taking advantage of Arden's military expansion. The Navy also increased the size of its Marine Corps. In the Nisburg Council, in the Speaker's office, Marcus smoked his pipe, the rising smoke unable to conceal the worry on his face. The door opened, and the Marcus Foster entered and sat down opposite him. Marcus asked, "Have you settled your family?" Marcus Foster nodded. "I sent them all to Aldo." "What about you?" Marcus smiled wryly. "The Northwest Bay of Aldo, perhaps. It's too far for me. I have some relatives in Eaton." The Marcus worried, "If we can't hold this place, Eaton will be in danger too." Marcus sighed. "We'll see then. Let's focus on the present. Right now, the whole of Nijmsburg is filled with anxiety. It feels like we'll collapse even before the church's army invades." Marcus Foster frowned and made a suggestion. "Give them money, give them money." "Yes," the Marcus gritted his teeth. "Open the Allied treasury and take out all the remaining money to incentivize the people to fight. Let them know that if the church's army enters the city, this wealth will be looted, and they will naturally fight harder." This, Speaker Marcus hesitated for a moment. "I don't think this will be very effective in improving the city's defenses, and the church's army will definitely plunder once they invade." Lord Foster didn't quite understand. "If we keep it in the treasury, won't it just get looted when the church's army comes in?" "How about this?" Marcus hesitantly offered his idea. "Transfer the remaining money to our allies, for example." Lord Foster frowned. Eaton, he shook his head again. You trust them that much? I think it's better to distribute it to our own citizens. With this wealth, we can continue organizing resistance among our allies. They might find it more effective to use this wealth themselves, rather than with a group of defeated citizens. The two argued for a while in the office about how to handle the remaining treasury wealth, but neither could convince the other. Then let all the members of parliament vote on it tomorrow. They reached a consensus. That was the only way. Marcus brought up another matter. Robin sent word that this is his final contribution to his homeland. Foster frowned. A contribution? Is he so sure it will work? Marcus nodded. The Aldo people in Lion City feel offended and are angry, while the church thinks the Aldo people are ungrateful. The antagonism between the two sides is escalating, Foster said unhappily. Robin should continue to add fuel to the fire, deepening their antagonism, instead of giving up and talking about a final contribution. Marcus disagreed. No, he's in a dangerous position within the church. It's already good enough that he's planted this seed. Besides, he's not the kind of person who formally pledges allegiance to the Alliance, a double agent. In short, don't contact Robin again until the situation turns around. It's better to have someone willing to help us than to expose him. The Protestant army and the guardians of the church, caught in the war, had planted a large number of spies within each other's ranks. The Robin Marcus mentioned wasn't exactly an Alliance spy within the church. He was merely someone who, because of his background, sympathized with the Alliance and was willing to offer some help while ensuring his own safety. The Marcus Foster sighed. I wonder if Newsburg will even survive long enough for that seed to sprout. Marcus patted him on the shoulder. Do your best. Chapter 721 Colin's Financial Crisis. After drifting at sea for more than half a month, the Arda fleet could finally spot the coastline of Horn Bay. Passing the nearby waters of Nysburg, they could already see huge plumes of smoke rising into the sky through their telescopes. According to the fleet's latest intelligence, the papacy had launched an offensive against Nysburg. Commander Queller was truly worried about Lion City. Under his orders, the Arda fleet raced relentlessly towards its target port. Fortunately, their destination was near Nysburg, and after a short voyage, when the fleet entered the port of Lion City, the nascent town showed no signs of fighting, and the entire fleet breathed a sigh of relief. Upon docking, Queller went straight to the town hall. The approach of this large southward-bound fleet to the port initially caused a small panic. Given the tense situation, panic was inevitable. But when someone saw the Arda naval flag being raised by the fleet, the panic instantly turned into joy, spreading throughout the city. Finally, Northwest Base sent men to protect them, and the dark clouds that had hung over the city for days dissipated. General Quake. Thank you for coming. In the city hall, upon learning of the fleet commander's arrival, Lister rushed to the hall and shook his hand warmly. Quake replied, I am here on the orders of Marcus Gleman to strengthen the defenses. The leaders of Lion Harbor were summoned to the city hall to discuss the latest situation with Quake and others. At the meeting, Quake announced Paul's order. Quake would assume the military command of Horn Bay. After everyone agreed, he immediately appointed Erwin to continue as the head of local defenses. After understanding the situation, he declined the welcome banquet jointly hosted by the city's merchants and hurriedly led his men to inspect the city's defenses. Meanwhile, at the camp of the Holy Sea's protectors, Edwin Cook, the commander appointed by the papacy, angrily rejected the Horn Bay Church's request. My mission is not to help you punish the heretics who defy God, but to help you plunder the wealth of the innocent. He was furious. The local church actually wanted his army to attack the neutral Ordos, which General Cook, who prided himself on chivalry, felt insulted. Even putting aside chivalry, from a purely military perspective, what good would it do to create another enemy? These troublemakers who only knew how to chant scriptures, no wonder he couldn't handle the Protestant Alliance, and the Vatican had to come all the way to clean up their messes. General, please understand, said the representative sent by Archbishop Elvis of Horn Bay. While your soldiers are fighting valiantly, it is the Ordos of Lion Harbor who are engaging in dirty deals with those blasphemers. Countless supplies of food and weapons have been delivered to the blasphemers. Otherwise, our war would not be so difficult. Therefore, the people of Lion Harbor are our enemies, and they stand against the Father. General Cook frowned. But the Ordos also trade with us, and a large portion of our weapons are bought from them. He disagreed with the Archbishop's representative. They charge us far more than the normal price. The representative gritted his teeth. A bunch of unscrupulous merchants who inflate prices. Their purses are filled not only with money but also with the blood of countless people who sacrificed themselves for God. Cook waved his hand. The attack on Nisburg is already very difficult. Let's not invite too many surprises. With that, he tossed his cloak and left. The envoy's expression shifted between anger and uncertainty. After sitting for a while, he hurriedly left the tent, paced around the camp, and then entered another tent. King Collins had been waiting there for a long time. He immediately went to greet the envoy. "Your Excellency, how did it go? Did that stubborn cook agree?" "Agree my ass," the envoy cursed. "It seems there's no way to get anything from him." King Collins was speechless for a moment, his face stiffening. The envoy briefly recounted his conversation with General Cook. "Couldn't you have held out a little longer?" Seeing the king's ashen face, he couldn't help but frown. "Hold out? How can I hold out?" King Collins suddenly shouted as if he were about to collapse. "If I don't find some money, how am I supposed to pay my soldiers?" He paced anxiously around the tent, each step heavy and loud, his arms flailing furiously. "Do you know? This damned war has emptied our national treasury. The inland countries of Cape Bay were never as wealthy as the coastal countries. When they launched the war, they thought that with the support of the papacy, they could quickly wipe out the Protestant alliance. However, their previous defeat in the north dashed their hopes. As the papacy changed its strategy and increased its investment in Cape Bay, the papacy's forces slowly chipped away at the south. Although it was a cautious, step-by-step approach, this process still depleted the already meager coffers of the inland countries. The envoy exclaimed, "Once we take Nisburg, will His Majesty still worry about not having enough money to pay the army? I doubt how much money is left in Nisburg." King Collins' eyes were red. "And when will we take Nisburg? A month, 2 months, or a year? I have no doubt about the victory of the papacy's army. But if this continues, future history will record this ridiculous history. On the eve of victory, the mighty King of Collins was overthrown because of unpaid wages. How ridiculous." Looking at the hysterical king, the envoy said, "If we really want to take Lion Harbor, we also need to consider the Kingdom of Alder." The Kingdom of Alder? King Collins looked at the envoy as if he were an idiot. "Does that kingdom still exist? Don't you know anything about what's happening there? There are orcs to the north and Giles to the south. This country has long since fallen apart. What kind of protection can it offer to Lion Harbor, which is so far away? Besides, Lion Harbor is not the property of the royal family." "Wait," King Collins shouted, "I've got it. I've got it." "What have you got?" the envoy asked hastily. "Giles." "Yes, Giles. Didn't he already agree to stand with us against those blasphemers?" King Collins exclaimed excitedly, his earlier despair vanishing as if he had discovered something incredible. "Bringing the Aldous to fight the Aldous, that's a brilliant idea. I've met him, I know him. As long as we promise him a share of the port's wealth, Giles will definitely agree." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 722 Port Invasion. The night sky was filled with dark clouds, obscuring the moon and stars, casting a shadow over Lion Harbor. Only the lighthouse in the dock area still burned brightly, guiding ships in the distant seas. A convoy approached the port following this light. The dutiful port authority officer noticed the situation and immediately dispatched a small boat to inspect it. As the boat approached the lead vessel, they were required to check the new ship's port entry permit and get a general idea of the cargo. Once the ship docked, more personnel would board for a more detailed inspection and collect taxes based on the type and value of the cargo. "Jess. Is that Jess?" someone on the lead ship suddenly shouted to the small boat below. "Martin, is that you?" "Haha, it's me. I recognized you immediately, and sure enough, it is. My permit is still valid, remember that?" the convoy continued to shout to the small boat. On the Port Authority's small boat, a staff member asked his colleague, whom the crew called Jess, "Do we still need to board for inspection?" Jess shook his head. "No need. Martin is a regular here. He's right, their entry permits are still valid. Let them enter the port. We'll check them more carefully once they're ashore." The Port Authority's small boat guided the entire fleet of 5 large ships into Lion Harbor, slowly approaching the dock amidst the crashing waves. A team was already on standby at the dock. Although the fleet had entry permits, All necessary inspection procedures were still required, especially during this tense period. Security in Lion Harbor was much tighter than before. The gangplank was lowered with a thud, connecting the ships to the dock. A port official, carrying a lantern, stepped onto the gangplank, asking as he walked, "What cargo are you transporting?" But the moment his foot touched the ship, a flash of silver light suddenly appeared from the darkness, piercing the unfortunate man's abdomen. He only had time to utter a "ugh" before the port staff on the dock could react. A continuous whooshing sound shattered the silence of the night. Countless sharp crossbow bolts rained down from the deck onto the dock, instantly killing more than half of the crew. Enemies, the survivors were terrified. Those who reacted quickly immediately sprinted towards the shore, shouting at the top of their lungs. It wasn't just this one ship, the same thing happened to the 5 ships that had just docked. Agile crew members, armed with knives and guns, quickly took control of the nearby dock under the cover of crossbow bolts. "Thank you, Mr. Martin." On the lead ship, a man in a black cloak thanked Martin. The man he called Martin was a middle-aged man nearing 40, lean, with a shrewd glint in his eyes. "Haha," he forced a laugh. "It's my honor to be able to help Grand Duke Giles." The man in the black cloak nodded. "His Highness the Duke always rewards merit and will certainly grant you the franchise you desire." Martin's heart didn't seem entirely consumed by joy. His expression revealed a mixture of happiness and worry. Glancing at the crew who had already jumped ashore and were rushing into the harbor, Martin said, "Lion Harbor should be heavily guarded now." "Are you confident?" the cloaked man scoffed, seemingly mocking Martin's timidity. "Do you know what kind of army this is?" "What they are called?" The cloaked man paused, emphasizing his words. "The Undead Army." "The Undead Army?" "The legendary Undead Army." Martin's mouth formed an O. He had heard that Duke Giles of Greed possessed a powerful army, whose soldiers were known for their bravery, fearlessness, immense strength, and exceptional martial arts skills. They could march and fight without sleep, food, or water, their physical abilities far exceeding the limits of ordinary people. Moreover, this army numbered only 6,000, never expanding nor shrinking. Its members seemed to have remained the same, hence the name Immortal Army. Duke Giles had actually dispatched such an elite force to seize Lion Harbor? The cloaked man chuckled sinisterly. "These northerners are so preoccupied with defending against land threats that they probably never imagined an enemy would come from the sea. How arrogant." "We still can't be careless. I heard there are several thousand men stationed here," Martin warned him. "Then let's make this place even more chaotic. Let the whole city descend into chaos." The cloaked man suddenly stretched out his arm, palm facing forward, chanting incantations. Martin and the others sensed something gathering in the cloaked man's palm. Suddenly, a burst of intense heat erupted from the palm of his hand, followed by a dazzling light. A ball of flame materialized out of thin air in the cloaked man's hand, then detached and shot towards the shore. A pile of wooden crates, as high as a small mountain, lay on the bank. The sudden flame struck the crates, and with a whoosh, a raging inferno erupted. "I'll engulf the entire city in flames," the cloaked man roared with laughter. "Witchcraft, witchcraft," Martin was dumbfounded. Giles had spellcasters among his ranks? But a weight lifted from his heart. With both the Undead Army and spellcasters, it seemed Giles was determined to take this city. Although he felt somewhat sorry for the city, to be honest, he quite liked this port. Joining Grand Duke Giles might be a better option. Just as Martin was thinking this, the situation changed slightly. From his direct left, a deafening roar, like muffled thunder, suddenly resounded. Then a burst of light erupted, strictly speaking, even before the sound, instinctively drawing the attention of everyone on deck to their left. They then saw a bright orange flame, so dazzling that it illuminated an area of nearly 100 meters around it, allowing Martin and the others to see the colossal vessel spewing the flame. A colossal vessel? That ship truly was a colossal vessel. Or rather, a castle built on its surface? Whoosh! Martin could feel something whizzing past him at high speed, the gust of air causing a stinging pain on half his body. Before anyone could figure out what was happening, a second burst of fire exploded, followed by a third, a fourth, clusters of flames erupting from the giant ship. They were unaware that their ship was luckily anchored next to the Alga Navy's sea fortress, and the dark, cloud-covered night prevented the intruders from immediately noticing the massive vessel nearby. As Giles's men began their operation, the sentries on the sea fortress immediately noticed the unusual activity nearby and rang the alarm. Because it was a period of war preparedness, the crew on board were quickly alerted and went into combat readiness. The captain, remaining on the ship, made a decisive decision to bombard the intruders' vessels. Chapter 723 Suppression. My God. What's happening? Lister was awakened from his sleep by a series of loud bangings on the door. My lord, our port has been invaded, came a terrified voice from outside. Invaded? Wait, where? Lister was still somewhat bewildered. The port? It's probably a group of pirates. Lister was suspicious. What kind of pirates would dare to attack a port controlled by Alda? I have to go see. He jumped out of bed and hurriedly searched for clothes to put on. Don't go, it's too dangerous. Sevia rushed over, her hair disheveled and uncombed. Her words reassured Lister somewhat. There are naval gunboats anchored in the port area, and a battalion of marines stationed there. They can't possibly be unable to stop a group of pirates. Just then, a bright light rose from the west, and the port area was engulfed in flames. Lister forced himself to calm down and quickly entered the corridor towards the anteroom, ordering as he went, summon all officials to the city hall and send men to scout the situation in the port area. Oh, and I need to contact General Quake immediately. Report. A naval officer in uniform emerged from around the corner, saluted Lister, and reported, General Quake has gone to the port area. He has ordered all armed forces to prepare for defense as previously planned and hopes you can reassure the residents and prevent panic from spreading. Lister slapped his forehead. That's it. If the port is just a feint, we can't fall for it. Do as the general says. Everyone calmed down and hurried to the anteroom to await the arrival of their respective leaders. At this moment, Sevia pulled up her hood, covering her long black hair. I'll go to the port and see if I can help. You? Lister grabbed her arm. It's too dangerous. Seeing the deep worry in the man's eyes, Sevia smiled. Don't worry, I won't put myself in danger. You want to know how it is there, right? I guarantee that no one here knows how to hide and protect themselves better than me. Lister hesitated for a moment, then nodded in agreement. You go with the army, don't get caught in the crossfire. What terrifying weapons, Martin cried out in fear, clutching his head and lying down behind a pile of barrels on the deck. As a merchant who frequently traveled to and from Lion Harbor, he had heard of these firearms used by the Northwesterners, and because of the recent strengthening of the port's defenses, he had even heard the sound of the garrison testing cannons from afar. He hadn't paid any attention until now, when he himself became the target of such weapons. With a thunderous roar, metal projectiles hurtled towards them at high speed. The ship Martin was on was made of fine oak, incredibly hard, even an axe would have to work hard to leave a mark. But even with such sturdy planks, they were like cardboard before the Northwesterners' bullets, easily riddled with holes, splinters flying everywhere. Was such power truly something human could create? Those who hadn't disembarked, including their own crew and Giles's warriors, were all doomed. Some were directly hit by bullets, limbs flying off, others were struck by the flying splinters, falling to the ground screaming in agony. Get off! Get off! Staying here will only make you targets. Amidst the sounds of impact, shattering, and screams, the cloaked man continued to shout, trying to regain command. He, like Martin, lay prone on the deck. He had just been struck in the right arm by a flying piece of wood, the splinter was embedded in his flesh, and the blood seeping out soaked through his right sleeve. This blow was completely unexpected for the cloaked man. He had assumed the greatest ranged resistance he would encounter would be arrows and crossbow bolts. Dirk Doyle, Martin shouted his name. You're going to kill me, shut up. It was just an accident. As long as we get ashore and follow the plan, things will go back to normal. The mage named Doyle finally made up his mind. Taking a risk, he leaped off the deck and plunged into the sea with a splash. He endured the pain in his right arm and climbed onto the dock. Fortunately, his men who had already landed had begun to move. They set fires and created chaos, killing the locals who came to resist them. Doyle estimated the number of men. Apart from his own ship, which had been heavily damaged, all the men on the other ships had come ashore. Including the desperate men on Martin's ship, he had about 1,000 men at his disposal. He took out a map he had prepared beforehand. Now he had to gather his forces and take advantage of the chaos to attack the city's most important building, the town hall, while simultaneously signaling an attack to his allies in the Guardians of the Faith outside. Guardians of the Faith? Disgusting. As a spellcaster, he cursed inwardly. He never dreamed he would cooperate with the church's lackeys, but it was an order from Grand Duke Giles, and he had no choice but to obey. Since his pleasant cooperation with the Arcane Society, Giles had witnessed the power of so-called wizards, But the Arcane Society's passive support for him in the war's logistics infuriated him. Therefore, the Grand Duke resolved to organize his own wizarding force. This was no easy task. Most spellcasters adhered to the principle of seclusion, harboring strong suspicion towards secular rulers and carefully concealing their identities. Giles had to exert considerable effort to recruit some, and Dirk Doyle was one of them. Because this mission required cooperation with the Hornby Church, many spellcasters resisted, but Doyle stepped forward, expressing his willingness to go through fire and water for the Grand Duke. At this moment, Doyle looked at a warehouse already ablaze, engulfed in flames, a good tool. He muttered to himself and pointed towards the warehouse. With a sudden whoosh, the flames on the warehouse grew larger and changed shape dramatically, transforming into tentacles that then coiled together, eventually forming a strangely shaped flower. While the effect was bizarre, it was merely a signal. Giles's warriors, who had been creating chaos, saw the signal and immediately gathered near the warehouse. Doyle waited beside the warehouse. 10, 20, 30, 100, more and more of his men gathered around him. Soon they would be able to attack the city hall. But as time passed, fewer and fewer men arrived, and a sense of foreboding grew within him. A dense, rapid sound of approaching footsteps confirmed his fears. A large number of uniformly dressed soldiers appeared at the street corner, all wielding strange long-handled weapons. "Quick! Kill them!" Doyle shouted, and the undead warriors swarmed forward, yelling as they charged at the appearing defenders. After a flash of fire, accompanied by a series of explosions, the charging undead warriors fell one after another. The Marine battalion stationed in the port area reacted swiftly, rushing out of their barracks as soon as the first flames appeared. After determining that intruders had infiltrated from the docks and were causing chaos, the battalion commander immediately ordered a squad-by-squad clearing of the streets, ensuring the squads were not too far apart for rapid regrouping. Based on the intruders' movements, they quickly located the warehouse with the largest fire. The battalion commander immediately ordered an end to the pursuit of scattered saboteurs, concentrating forces to eliminate the core area. The newly assembled intruders were quickly surrounded and attacked. Chapter 724 Countermeasures. The residents of Lion Harbor had spent the night in fear. They had been sleeping soundly when they were suddenly awakened by the roar of cannons. A towering flame shot into the sky from the direction of the harbor, a truly terrifying sight. Faced with this situation, no one could sleep. Women huddled at home, trembling and praying, while men went outside to inquire with their neighbors. It wasn't until the city hall sent officers into the streets, using loudspeakers to announce that a small group of pirates had infiltrated and were causing damage, but had been surrounded and suppressed by the army, that the situation improved. Residents were ordered to return home immediately and were forbidden from spreading rumors. At the same time, a large number of police officers began to block all major intersections, prohibiting passage and gatherings. The flames from the harbor caused great distress to many owners who had goods stored in warehouses, fearing that their possessions would be burned, and cursing the damned pirates to hell. This situation continued until dawn. The morning sun dispelled the darkness, and the city hall issued a notice lifting the city lockdown. Everyone finally breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed the situation had finally calmed down. The once quiet streets were suddenly filled with people, eager for more information. Most residents of Lion Harbor were involved in maritime trade, and the sudden appearance of such a daring pirate group was bound to cause a stir. This is the first time the city has been invaded. It seems to have a significant impact on public morale. Lister stood by the conference room window, looking out with a worried expression. The city hall's main gate led to the city's central square, and many people were now blocking the entrance, inquiring about the situation. The guards could only try to appease them, saying they had no information other than that the pirates' identities were still unknown. In fact, they truly didn't know. Even the Lion City's higher-ranking officials had only just received a few clues. Lister turned around, his stern gaze fixed on Martin, the merchant who was bound hand and foot and kneeling on the ground. "Duke Giles is one of the most esteemed lords in the kingdom. If he finds out you framed him, he will skin you alive." Martin was already terrified, trembling all over as he said, "I swear on my life, I would never dare to deceive you, Lord Lister. It was Duke Giles who coerced me into helping him invade Lion Harbor. My entire family is under Giles's control, so I had no choice but to obey the Duke's orders. Otherwise, how could I, a mere merchant, dare to touch the Marquis of Gremmon's backside? How could I dare to touch the tiger's backside?" Lister's brows furrowed even more. He looked at the naval commander, Quake, who was present. Quake shook his head. Those warriors who formed the main force of the invasion were very strange. They were able to fight to the last moment despite being seriously injured. We didn't even manage to capture one alive. As for the ordinary crew members, they knew nothing. They only knew that they cooperated with the warriors under their orders. Lister was troubled. So far, it was only Martin's side of the story. Although Giles's reputation as a traitor was widely known throughout Alder, he now nominally acknowledged the royal family's rule and maintained a fragile peace. Was someone deliberately escalating tensions among the Alder lords? Just then, a servant quietly approached and whispered a few words to Lister. "Gentlemen, excuse me for a moment. You may continue the interrogation," Lister said, hurriedly leaving the meeting hall and rushing to his office, where Scipio was already waiting for him. "My goodness! Where have you been all night?" Lister almost cried with joy. His heart, which had been hanging in suspense, finally settled. He rushed forward and embraced the witch tightly. Scipio had volunteered to go to the port last night and hadn't returned. Lister had thought something had happened to her and was heartbroken, but as the city's administrator, he hadn't shown it to anyone. Scipio quietly enjoyed the sweet moment before pulling away from Lister's embrace. "I'm sorry to have worried you. Last night I went to track down a spellcaster, but unfortunately he escaped." Lister was taken aback. "A spellcaster? Could it be?" Silvio confirmed. "That's right, one of those intruders was a spellcaster. And his master is Giles." "Giles?" Lister instantly thought of the information he had obtained from Martin. "How do you know?" "I know that guy, Dirk Doyle." Sylvia gritted her teeth and said, "A shameless, unprincipled man who would sell his soul to the devil for his own benefit. He used to pass messages in our circle, recruiting spellcasters for his master, and his allegiance was to Giles." "That matches up. That matches up. It really is Giles. We interrogated a prisoner, and he also said he was acting on Giles' orders." Lister was somewhat excited, but also mixed with a bit of fear. Why would the Northwest Bay provoke the hostility of such a powerful southern lord? He was so panicked while fleeing that he dropped this. Silvio handed him something. Lister took it and exclaimed, "Collins' badge." The witch opposite him frowned. "That shameless bastard has sided with Collins again. Good heavens, Collins is the most trusted lackey of the Horn Bay Church, who has killed countless of our compatriots. I underestimated Dirk Doyle's wickedness." The witch's words were utterly disgusting. Lister pondered, is it possible that Giles and the Horn Bay Church are colluding, and this badge is a tool for identifying friend from foe? Because those warriors do indeed look like residents of Aldenon, I must report this to Lockhart immediately. I've never liked causing trouble, so why did I have to encounter something like this? Paul stared blankly at the letter on the table, his expression extremely sad. It was an urgent report, informing him of what had just happened in Horn Bay. Although the invasion was thwarted, he felt as if he had been slapped in the face for no reason. Paul believed he had no past or present grudges against Giles, and he simply couldn't understand the other's motives. Hansel, who was present, smiled upon hearing Paul's lament. "Your Excellency, some people just think like that. To them, there are only two kinds of people in the world, friends or enemies. Since you rejected Giles's offer, he sees you as automatically joining the enemy ranks." Paul nodded, quickly returning to reality, and asked the others, "Lion Harbor is isolated overseas. It's not good if these guys keep causing trouble. But we're too far from Giles's territory. It seems the only option is to use the Navy to blockade his port. Are there any other countermeasures?" Hansel immediately suggested. As if he had already thought of one, "We are far from Giles, but the royal domain is very close. Perhaps the warm climate of the south has made His Excellency too comfortable. We need to give him some stimulation." Chapter 725. Wolf Giles was furious. Dirk Doyle, the wizard he had placed so much hope in, had led 1,000 of his most elite warriors to Lionport. They were planned as a dagger to the Northwesterners, striking unexpectedly and then, in conjunction with their Collins allies outside the city, capturing this small but incredibly wealthy city. But the wizard had failed the Grand Duke's expectations. He had failed and returned in disgrace. Doyle was fortunate. It was a crucial time for the Grand Duke to recruit spellcasters, so he wasn't severely punished, only given a stern reprimand. Giles wasn't naive enough to believe that Paul Gleman, one of the most powerful lords in the Alder Kingdom, couldn't even find out who was behind the attack by thousands. He had to prepare for Gleman's wrath before he uncovered everything. but the Grand Duke hadn't expected Paul Gleman to know so early. A merchant from the Northwest Bay who came to Guangzhou handed him a handwritten letter from Paul Gleman. The contents of the letter left the Grand Duke of Greed speechless. Gleman began by saying, "I know you did this." He expressed his indignation and severely condemned Giles. But the problem lay in the end, where the word seemed to imply something. If Giles could provide a plausible explanation, the matter would be dropped. This. After reading it once, Giles rubbed his eyes and, filled with great suspicion, carefully read the letter again. Finally, he concluded, either it was a conspiracy, and if it was a conspiracy, he couldn't trust him, or Gleman was in some predicament, and if he was in trouble, wouldn't he be even more at his mercy? After careful consideration, Giles believed the latter was more likely, because Gleman's territory currently bordered the Orcs, and those grassland barbarians were not easy to deal with. So he decided to send a stronger force to conquer Lionport and seize its wealth, while Giles was preoccupied with other matters. He had to be quick. A failed attack might spur those greedy and cowardly merchants to hastily move their riches away. He wrote a reply and sent it to the Northwest Bay. Paul was enraged. He had made one last attempt at peace, only to be brutally trampled upon by Giles. Giles inwardly mocked Paul's cowardice, declaring he would show him the harsh realities of the world as payment for his repeated refusal to recruit him. This arrogant attitude reminded Paul of Malskent from years ago, that damned bastard who deserved to be struck by lightning. Since defeating Malskent, taking control of the Northwest Bay, becoming a guest of honor at court, and a hero who held back the Orcs, everyone treated him with utmost respect, even if they secretly loathed him. This long-lost sense of humiliation hadn't been felt for years. This humiliation fueled his drive, energized him, and triggered a surge of dopamine. Regardless of the sincerity of Paul's peace efforts, Giles would pay the price. Hansel Abbott was dispatched by Paul to Crystal Radiance, accompanied by a military advisory group led by Claude. When news of their arrival reached the palace, King Rodney's VIE laughed heartily. With the aid of substantial military scrip, Rodney's VIE had amassed a considerable army, one entirely under his control, free from external interference. However, after learning in detail about the Arda army's performance in the war against the Orcs, the king was no longer content with building an army of the old era. His Majesty's primary concern was how to quickly elevate his forces to a level approaching that of the Arda army, at least in terms of soldier quality. Ideally, his army would be guided by a group of experienced officers, and now the king's dream had come true. The officers of the Advisory Council, now more accurately called instructors, carefully observed the king's new army. They were pleased to find that His Majesty's rations for the soldiers were quite good. Compared to the conscripted soldiers in most armies of the time, the king's soldiers were rosy-cheeked, in good spirits, and showed no signs of malnutrition. This was good. Their physical fitness should be able to handle the high-intensity training of the Arda style. However, their work involved far more than simply getting the soldiers into formation and running drills. That could be easily accomplished by picking any soldiers from the Arda army. The most important task for the Arda instructors was to organize these soldiers. More precisely, to improve their organizational skills. After all, even in the old-style army, there was still organization, but that organization was more about interpersonal relationships. An army's organization involves many aspects, most notably in combat. The saying goes, a poor soldier is just one poor soldier, but a poor general makes a poor army. In the old-style army, a charismatic and capable general could lead his troops to create miracles, but if his position was replaced by someone less capable, the overall quality of the army would decline disproportionately compared to the quality of the commanding officer. Furthermore, in the old army, different levels of units often only obeyed their direct superiors. If the superiors became incompetent, the subordinates would be at a loss, unsure of whom to listen to or what decisions to make. History is replete with examples of armies collapsing rapidly after the loss of key figures. Additionally, it must be said that many old-style armies possess numerous disciplinary regulations, many of which were quite reasonable and considered all aspects, but their implementation proved problematic. In Paul Gleman's view, occasionally breaking the rules to resolve unfamiliar, special, or unexpected situations can be called special handling. However, in the Kingdom of Alder, this wasn't limited to the military. The entire kingdom's official institutions, from top to bottom, including the ruling teams of the various lords, were almost entirely driven by a special treatment mentality in minor matters. How a matter was handled, whether it followed the rules, and the extent of enforcement depended on the likes and dislikes, moods, personal relationships, and even a spur-of-the-moment decision of those in power. It was considered a minor matter because they were quite strict on important issues: hierarchy, the duties of ruler and subject, tax types, tax rates, and matters concerning the dignity and wealth of those in power were all strictly enforced. Returning to the military, another issue arose. Illiterate lower-ranking officers and soldiers couldn't grasp many of the rules and regulations, and everything depended entirely on their superiors. This led to interpersonal relationships carrying even greater weight in the organizational structure. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.